Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're looking at some of the great puzzles of the ancient world, mysteries that have left scientists and historians searching for answers even today. Across the globe, civilizations built monuments and left behind artifacts that still spark questions. How were the stones of Stonehenge moved and arranged? What was the true purpose of the Nazca lines stretching across the desert of Peru? Why did entire cultures, like the Maya, collapse, leaving behind vast cities reclaimed by the jungle? And what secrets might still lie beneath the sands of Egypt or the ruins of Easter Island? As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to fall asleep, to wonder, or just to wander through history, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. The desert wakes with a pale light that turns the limestone to gold, and the plateau reveals its geometry as if the earth itself had learned the language of stars. There, lifted from the bedrock that anchors the Nile to memory, stands the Great Pyramid of Khufu, sovereign of the 4th dynasty, raised around 2550 before Christ during the Old Kingdom. In the still air of morning, it has the calm of a mountain and the precision of a surveyor's dream. The base runs about 230 meters to a side. The original height rose to 146 meters, and the casing that once flashed like water in the sun came from the quarries at Tura. Fine white limestone laid so close that a knife's edge could scarcely find the seam. Inside, the living core is local stone, rougher and darker. At the heart, the king's chamber is cased in red granite ferried from Aswan against the current, and above that chamber, an ingenious stack of 5 relieving spaces breaks and spreads the weight, a corbelled triumph that has held firm for more than 4 millennia. The Grand Gallery climbs toward that chamber with courses that lock like teeth, its floor a polished run of limestone, its slots and ramps the work of engineers who built in the language of levers and counterweights rather than words. The whole colossus speaks in ratios and angles. The slope leans a whisper under 52 degrees. The base is level across its length, within a breadth that shames later ages. Each of the 4 sides faces a quarter of the sky, with a fidelity to north and south and east and west, so true that even modern instruments bow a little in respect. Walk the plateau, and the monument becomes a city of the dead that once pulsed with the work of the living. To the east and west lie rows of mastabas, flat-roofed tombs for nobles and overseers, each with a chapel where offerings were placed and a false door through which the spirit might pass. Across the sand stand the mortuary temple and the long causeway that once ran to the valley temple near the river, a ceremonial artery by which the dead king traveled in ritual from river to tomb and by which the living carried in offerings for eternity. Northward and southward the other pyramids rise, Khafre with his dark cap of surviving casing, Menkaure smaller and stubborn. And in the lower ground, the lion body and human face of the Sphinx watches the horizon as if listening for a voice that no longer speaks. The plateau is not a single tomb, but a planned landscape where architecture, theology, and astronomy converse. Every block and lintel, every axis and court, was drawn into a geometry that married earth to heaven. It is an easy thing to stand below those flanks and imagine sorcery, yet the ground tells a human story. At Hayt el Ghurab, southeast of the pyramids, excavators uncovered a workers' town laid out with barracks and bakeries, with brewers' vats and long galleries stacked with bread molds, with cattle bones and fish spines left from meals hearty enough to fuel a nation of laborers. The graves of some of those workers lie nearby, not cast aside but interred with care, some with healed fractures and spines worn by load and labor. Proof of a workforce that was fed and tended and honored by burial within sight of the king they raised. On blocks within hidden chambers above the king's room, a handful of rough red marks record gang names that feel like signatures. Friends of Khufu, the White Crown of Khnum Khufu. They are not the scrawl of slaves beneath the lash, but the graffiti of crews proud to serve a vision larger than any one life. One can almost hear the bustle of a season when the river ran high and farmers, freed from the fields by the flood, answered royal conscription with hands and shoulders and the promise of pay in bread and beer. A papyrus discovered at Wadi al-Jarf gives the logistics a face and a voice. In the journal of an official named Mira, a middle manager in reed and ink, we read of teams moving fine Tura limestone by boat along the canalized waters of the Nile to a place called Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, which is the pyramid's true name. The entries are spare and matter of fact, men and cargo counted in regular strokes, days measured by the flow of water and the turn of work. They speak of switching docks, of unloading to causeways, of the rhythm by which stone moved from quarry to pier, from pier to ramp, from ramp to course, until a mountain grew by the quiet arithmetic of labor repeated thousands of times. There is poetry in that paper, as sure as in any hymn, because the hand that wrote it expected the sun to rise again and the crews to return, and because the bureaucracy behind it turned a river into a road. As for the setting out of that mountain, the alignment is a riddle that scholars answer with patient observation rather than myth. The faces stand almost square to the quarters of the compass, missing true north by a sliver measured in minutes of arc. How did Old Kingdom surveyors find such a north without iron needle or spinning wheel? Perhaps they watched the circle of the circumpolar stars and marked the moment when a pair of them straddled the invisible line of the pole, then bisected the angle of their nightly swing with plumb line and cord. Perhaps they walked the shadow of a gnomon at different hours and found the points that balance day. However they did it, they set their lines to the sky and then hammered them into stone, proving that the measure of the heavens was within the reach of eyes and patience. The scheme of internal shafts that pierce the masonry from the king's chamber outward seems to share that cosmology. One looks toward the stars that never set, the imperishables, another toward Orion, the celestial body of Osiris, the god with whom a king hoped to be joined. Whether for air or for ritual sight or for something between breath and prayer, those channels lace architecture to belief. Tools and technique have left their fingerprints in quarries and on blocks. Copper chisels bite soft limestone, but dolerite pounders gnaw harder beds where copper fails, and both have been found scarred by use and abandoned where the stone no longer yielded profit. Stone was cut free with trench and wedge, then dragged on sledges. Reliefs in tombs show water poured before the runners, and experiments in our own time have shown that dampened sand stiffens and halves the friction. On the plateau, the ghosts of ramps lie where the desert still holds their outlines, whether straight as a spear from base to rising course, or wrapped like a serpent around the growing body of the pyramid, or multiplied into compounds of embankment and lever where teams lifted blocks from step to step. Holes bored in bedrock at certain points may have anchored posts and pulleys. The story of construction is not one method, but a suite of methods chosen for stage and stone, the way a captain trims sail to wind and current rather than trust one rope to all weathers. Within, the architecture tightens from vast to intimate, as if the monument were a funnel that concentrates the world into a single chamber where stone and silence are thick. The ascending passage climbs from the low entrance on the north face, rising into the tall and narrow grand gallery, whose corbelled walls step inward as they rise. A canyon in masonry, whose floor once held timbers or stone slabs used to lock and guard. Far above, the 5 relieving spaces lie like a stacked forest of granite beams and limestone ceilings that force the weight of millions of tons to flow around the chamber like water parting around a rock. When Colonel Howard Vyse blasted open those upper spaces in the 19th century, he found, along with soot and dust, the red quarry marks that named Khufu and the gangs that moved the stone. The king's sarcophagus is a box of Aswan granite, too large to have been brought through the passages, so the room must have risen around it, a puzzle solved by construction and not by magic. Every feature, from the plugged ascending corridor to the portcullis, to the perfectly flat floor of the chamber, belongs to an engineering logic that was both functional and deeply symbolic. It is a machine for eternity, as much as it is a tomb. The surrounding complex completes the design. The mortuary temple at the pyramid's foot received daily offerings so that the king would eat forever, and priests served there long after Khufu had vanished into myth. The causeway ran to the valley temple, where the embalmed body arrived by boat, a journey from river to desert that echoed the path of the sun from birth to death and back again. The names that officials gave to their boats and officers, the titles carved on their false doors, the lists of offerings on chapel walls, all show a state that could concentrate labor and wealth without chaos, a court that made ritual into administration and administration into ritual. Even the choice of site was policy disguised as piety. The plateau offered bedrock close to the surface, a clean foundation. It stood near Memphis, the royal city, and within ready reach of the river and the quarries to the east. Nature gave them stone and water. Faith gave them purpose. Organization gave them the bridge between. Stand again beneath that northern face at dusk, when the heat drains from the stone and the wind carries a memory of bread and beer, and it is not hard to sense why later ages sought gods or giants to explain what they saw. Yet the truth honors the builders more than fantasy can. Farmers conscripted during the flood season, quarrymen hardened by dust and glare, overseers with tall staffs and talliers' pallets, stonemasons with copper in their hands and dolerite at their feet, cooks stirring the smell of ground grain in ovens the size of chariots, boatmen hauling rope and sail against the current, scribes scratching days and deliveries on shards of pottery, all move together to raise a horizon for a single name. The pyramid is a miracle, but it is a human miracle. The stones remember the touch of many hands. There is a temptation as old as wonder itself to make the impossible into the work of gods. For centuries, travelers stood before Khufu's mountain of stone and swore that ordinary hands could not have lifted it into being. The Greeks asked by what devices such a thing could rise, and Herodotus, curious but credulous, passed along tales of machines and 100,000 laborers who worked for 20 years. Medieval writers spoke of secret texts and forbidden arts. In later ages, dreamers would claim that the layout of the plateau was a map of the heavens or a message left by a vanished race that taught Egypt its arts. The pyramid became a mirror where every generation saw its own fears and hopes reflected. Yet when the dust is brushed from the rock, and the shovel turns up the daily leavings of a workforce, a quieter story takes the stage, one that honors the builders far more. The settlement at Hayt el Ghurab, with its barracks and bakeries and breweries, the healed bones of laborers buried with a measure of respect, the scuffed sled runners and dolerite pounders abandoned in quarries, the short, sharp notes of Mira's papyrus describing cargoes of fine Chura stone ferried by canal to the horizon of Khufu, these speak of a nation that could plan and provision and persist. The miracle becomes human once more, and in becoming human, it grows more impressive, for there is grandeur in order and endurance that needs no sorcery. Even so, questions remain that the desert keeps like coins under its tongue. The eternal dispute over ramps and levers is a chess match that has played across a century of scholarship. Some argue for a straight earthen causeway that climbed as the courses rose, a long brown river of compacted fill-up which stones could be hauled with ropes and teams that sang to keep time. Others see a spiral climbing the flanks, a path that hugged the rising faces and turned the task into a circuit. Still others imagine a compound of short ramps and clever levering, block lifted to ledge by ledge, each ascent captured and made secure before the next. The truth may be a blend that shifted with stage and stone, for ancient engineers were not tied to one doctrine, but adapted to circumstance. The marks in bedrock that may have anchored posts, the embanked traces at the foot of the monument, the wear patterns on the approaches, these are letters in an alphabet of method that we are still learning to read. It is right that a structure which stood as the tallest work of human hands for nearly 4,000 years should retain a few riddles, like a king who never reveals all the tricks of his court. The accuracy with which the four sides face the quarters of the sky stirs its own debate. Learned men and women have stood with instruments where ancient surveyors once stood with plumb line and cord, and they have measured an error so small that it vanishes into the breath of the wind. Was true north found by watching the dance of circumpolar stars and bisecting their swing around a point that the eye cannot see, but the mind can fix, or by tracking the equal lengths of a noontide shadow and drawing an east to west line that can be squared to north and south, or by some ritual of observation we no longer practice. The narrow channels that lead out from the king's chamber have drawn the gaze of astronomers as well, for they point roughly toward the realm of the imperishable stars that never set, and toward the belt of Orion, which the Egyptians knew as the body of Osiris. This has led storytellers to declare that the whole complex is a star map set in stone, and that the trio of great pyramids mirrors the belt of the hunter in the sky. Egyptologists answer that the correspondences are loose and the chronology unkind to the claim, and that a symbolic pointing towards sacred regions of the sky does not require a blueprint copied from the firmament. In truth, the builders did not need to mirror 3 stars to bind their king to heaven. Their religion was already a cord that reached from horizon to horizon. There are more recent discoveries that have given the pyramid new chambers of rumor and fact. In our time, physicists have turned to the stone with particles as subtle as dust motes. They let the rain of cosmic muons wash through the body of the pyramid and counted how many arrived on the far side. Where the count rose, there must be emptiness. So it was that they announced the presence of a hidden space above the Grand Gallery, a void many tens of meters long, whose purpose is not yet known. Years later, careful imaging near the original entrance showed a straight corridor hidden behind the chevrons of the north face, a space tall enough for a man to walk, but left forever empty and sealed until a tiny camera peered into it. These are not signs of treasure rooms or engines of lost science, though the world wanted to believe so at once. They are more likely the practical work of ancient architects who knew how to make weight flow around the places where a king must lie and air must move. Or perhaps they are architectural relics from early stages of construction. Yet, even a prosaic explanation is a kind of wonder, for it reminds us that the builders mastered their material to a degree that still surprises modern minds. Against such evidence, the stranger claims have always broken, like waves on stone. In the last century, some declared that a sacred inch encoded prophecies in the passages, and that the length of an ancient cubit foretold the rise and fall of nations. Others wrote that the pyramids were power plants, and that their shape gathered forces that could sharpen a blade laid beneath a paper model, as if geometry could make a knife remember its edge. There were those who gave the credit to visitors from the sky, or to the drowned survivors of a mythic island who carried the secret arts across oceans. Archaeology is patient and stubborn. It countered with bread rations and fish bones, with copper chisels dulled by use, with graffiti that named crews after the king they served, with a ledger in a harbor storehouse that told a foreman where to take his boats on a certain day. The more we learn, the more the pyramid becomes the work of a people who trusted the river and their gods and their own organization. It is better than legends of strangers. It is theirs. Another argument lingers in the cool stone corridors where light seldom falls. If no body has been found inside Khufu's chamber, some whisper, was it truly a tomb? The sarcophagus is empty, and the treasures that would have fed a royal soul in the next world are gone. The answer lies in the history of invasion and need, in earthquakes that knocked casing stones free, in centuries when the buildings of a growing city were faced with limestone stripped from the flanks of ancient monuments, in careless breaches cut by treasure seekers and careful openings made by soldiers and scholars. The smaller pyramids of later kings were plundered long ago. The valley and mortuary temples were stripped and reused. There is every reason to think the Great Pyramid was looted in antiquity, perhaps in a time of turmoil when central order failed. The absence of a royal mummy does not erase the purpose the whole complex was designed to serve. In the Old Kingdom, the pyramid was a stairway and a fortress for a soul, a promise in stone that the king would join the sun in its daily rebirth. That promise does not vanish because the grave goods were stolen by the living. The legacy of Giza is not only in the desert, but in the minds of those who measured and drew and argued over it. When the French savants of Napoleon's expeditions set their instruments against the stone, they began a modern reckoning that filled volumes with plates and numbers. When Flinders Petrie returned in the 19th century with a theodolite and a distrust of sloppy claims, he gave us measurements that still anchor debate. In the middle of the 19th century, an English officer used gunpowder to blast his way into upper spaces and brought out the first firm evidence that named the king on the stones themselves. In our own era, the digging at the workers' town by persistent archaeologists gave the people who hauled the blocks their place in the story. The pyramid has been a school where methods sharpen and where fantasies are tested and often dismissed. It is an engine that turns curiosity into knowledge. The monument's shadow also falls across art and faith and politics. Medieval chroniclers wrote of the pyramids as antediluvian storehouses built before the flood. Poets saw in them the very shape of endurance. European travelers in the Age of Empires climbed their flanks to inscribe their names among the countless graffiti of Arabic and Coptic hands. who did the same in centuries before. The skyline of Cairo lives with the triangles forever on its edge, and the people of Egypt have made the site a symbol that is both national and universal. There are days when it feels as if the whole world stops at the foot of the plateau to take its measure. In that pause, there is commerce and argument. There is pride and sometimes frustration, for preservation must wrestle with the needs of a living city and the weight of many feet. The casing stones that once made Khufu's monument gleam were mostly taken in ages past to build mosques and palaces and houses. Earthquakes gave quarrymen their chance. What remains must be guarded from smog and groundwater and the thoughtless boot. The guardians of the plateau wage their own long war against time. Perhaps the deepest legacy is a change in how we understand ourselves. There was a time when people pointed to Giza and said that the ancients could not have done this without secrets that have been lost. Now, the secrets we value are of a different kind. The town that fed the workers matters as much as the stone that they raised. The ledger of a foreman matters as much as the line that faces true north. The stories of healed bones and orderly kitchens tell of a state and a society that could field a rotating labor force drawn from farms during the flood, pay them in rations of bread and beer, lodge them in barracks, and return them to their villages when the waters fell. What stands in the sun is the work of a bureaucracy as much as of a faith. It is a machine for organizing people as much as a machine for lifting stone. That recognition brings the pyramid closer to us, for we know too the cost and craft of collective effort. So the Great Pyramid holds its ground between the seen and the guessed. We can enter its passages and lay a hand against granite that came upriver on barges. We can stand in the chamber and listen to the steady breath of a monument that is older than most names. And still there will be chambers of purpose. We do not fully grasp and roots of construction. We can only reconstruct in models and the mind's eye. It is right that something so old and so ambitious should keep a few of its own counsels. The lesson it offers is not that the past was magical, but that the past was capable. A people with patience and vision set their king to rise forever on a horizon of stone, and 4,500 years later, the world still comes to watch the sunrise strike those flanks and turn them to fire. Before the day has properly risen, a cool mist hangs over Salisbury Plain and the first birds wake in the hedgerows. As the sun climbs, the chalk downs open like a pale sea and the great circle reveals itself in measured stone. There stands Stonehenge, not a single moment frozen in rock, but the long breath of a people set into earth and sky. What we see is the final form of many generations of labor. The first stroke came around 3100 BC when hands with antler picks cut a circular ditch and threw up a white bank from the chalk within. The ring spans a little over 100 meters across, and within it early builders set a circuit of pits we now call the Aubrey Holes. 56 cups in the chalk that first may have held timber posts and later received the burnt bones of the dead. In those small white bowls, archaeologists have found cremations of men and women and children, laid with care, and sometimes with tokens, making Stonehenge one of the great early cemeteries of Britain. The air of that first monument was wood smoke and chalk dust, not yet ringing stone on stone, and even then it was a place where the living stood with their dead and spoke to the year. The henge did not stand alone. The plain itself was an old sacred ground where ditches and long barrows and a great cursus ran like a track north of the circle. A straight monument more than 2.5 kilometers long whose purpose remains folded in ritual. To the east, a dry valley leads toward the River Avon, and long after the first bank was cut, a processional avenue would be laid there, 2 parallel ditches and banks marching from the circle to the water. The landscape is a woven thing. It gathers earlier graves and later earthworks into a web of meaning, so that no ring or barrow stands without reference to the rest. After centuries, the builders changed their ambition from earth and timber to the eloquence of stone. Around 2500 BC, while pyramids were rising in Egypt and palaces growing on Crete, people on Salisbury Plain raised the Great Sarsens. Hard sandstone blocks dragged from the Marlborough Downs, and likely from the woods known today as Westwoods to the north. These Sarsens are giants. Many weigh 20 tons or more, and some of the uprights in the inner horseshoe carry lintels as heavy as a small house. 5 great trilithons stood within the circle, 2 uprights with a capstone each, like gates to a vanished court. Around them ran a ring of 30 uprights crowned by 30 lintels. The builders cut mortise and tenon joints in stone as a master carpenter would in oak. On the faces where lintel meets lintel, they carved tongue and groove to knit the ring. To stand beneath those lintels and look along that curve is to see that Stonehenge is not a pile of boulders, but an engineered architecture where every surface and angle was chosen. They added a second language of rock that spoke from far away. Smaller stones of blue and grey came from the Preseli Hills of Western Wales, more than 200 kilometres distant as the crow flies. Those blue stones, each weighing 2 to 4 tons, were pried from outcrops like Carn Godog and Craig Rosy Phelan, and then brought by human will and craft across rivers and ridges to the plain. Whether they came by land with rollers and sledges from valley to valley, or down to the sea and along the coasts and into the Avon by raft and boat, they came, and that journey became part of the meaning of the stones. The blue stones were set and reset in different patterns through time, a moving choir within the fixed weight of the Sarsen circle. Among them lay the altar stone, a block of greenish sandstone that likely also came from Wales, a stranger among the chalk and sarsen that hints at long ties between far places. The ground around the circle preserves the craft of the makers. Flint tools litter the soil where they dress the sarsens on site, pecking and polishing the hard stone into smooth faces and rounded tenons. The tops of the uprights are not flat but gently curved, so that the lintel ring rises and falls like the rim of a shallow bowl, a subtlety one only understands by climbing into the sky in thought. The heelstone stands to the northeast beyond the ditch, a great outlier that marks the axis of approach, and 4 station stones once formed a rectangle that may have framed sightlines of the rising and setting moon and Sunday. The builders did not leave measures and diagrams for us, but they left alignments written in light. If you stand in the heart of the ring at dawn on the longest day, the sun comes up along the avenue and clears the horizon near the heelstone and lays a bright road into the stones. If you return on the shortest day and watch the evening, the sun will fall in the opposite quarter, so that the last light slides between the tallest trilithons. This was no accident of chance. It is the work of people who knew the year by bone and breath and set that knowledge in chalk and rock. To the northeast, on the bend of the Avon, there once stood another circle of bluestones later robbed and taken, a riverside monument now called by some Stonehenge. Between river and main circle the builders made the avenue, a ceremonial path that tied water and earth. The living likely came by boat and climbed that way with song and offerings. On the other side of the plain, 2 miles away, rises Durrington Walls, a vast bank and ditch that enclosed a settlement the size of a town. Their archaeologists have found the footprints of houses with chalk floors and post holes for walls, ovens and middens filled with pig and cattle bones and pottery smashed in feasts. Isotope readings from the teeth of those animals show they were brought from many parts of Britain, even from the far north, so that people traveled with livestock to a gathering on the plain. The pattern of slaughter points to midwinter and midsummer, times when night or day holds sway, as if the great circle and the timber circles at Durrington were paired theatres of sky and season. Where Stonehenge held the hard permanence of stone and the stillness of death and ancestor, Durrington held the warmth of hearth and the breath of the living. The river ran between them like a line between worlds. Beneath the grass and chalk new knowledge lies as patient as the stones. The digging of the last 2 generations has shown that Stonehenge did not change only once or twice, but many times over 1,000 years. The first ditch and bank and timber posts gave way to bluestones. Those were lifted and moved and set again. The great Sarsens arrived and were dressed and fitted and raised. Later still, the builders dug rings of pits outside the stones, the Y and Z holes, which they never filled with uprights, perhaps a plan abandoned or a ritual completed without a visible mark. The circle we see is a palimpsest of intent and revision. It is a record of memory where each generation inscribed its own line on a page already written. There is a beauty in the practical as much as in the mystical. Think of the men and women who quarried sarsen from the downs, hammering at the rock with stone mauls until a seam gave, levering with timber and packing with chalk to free a block. Think of the teams who looped thick ropes around a stone set on a wooden sledge and hauled it over greased rails, pausing to rebuild the track and pour water on packed chalk when dust choked the runners. Think of the carpenters who shape joints in unforgiving stone as precisely as a shipwright cuts a keel, and the quarryman who first saw the gleam of a bluestone where water had worn a face clean. None of this needed wizardry. It needed patience and numbers and the will to make a place where the wheel of the year could be seen and celebrated. When night gathers and the plain lies quiet, the stones do not speak, but the ground around them remembers. Cremation ash in the chalk remembers flames and prayers. Pig bones in a midden remember laughter and cold air in winter. The smooth hollows that once held wooden posts remember the dark circle that stood before the stone. The long banks of the avenue remember the footfall of many people walking from water to ring in light and in darkness. Stonehenge is not only a crown of megaliths on a green headland. It is a whole country of ritual, drawn together in a single gaze. Wonder invites stories, and Stonehenge has gathered them as surely as larks gather in the hedges before dawn. Long before spades and theodolites came to the plain, the circle lived in legend. Geoffrey of Monmouth told how a wizard named Merlin flew the stones from a holy mountain across the sea to set them as a memorial to the dead. A tale that answered the question of transport with a flourish of magic, and at the same time confessed the awe the monument inspires. Another story says the devil bought the stones from a woman far away and hurled one at a scoffing monk, which is why the heel stone leans by the avenue with a bruise upon it. In the 17th and 18th centuries, learned men looked upon the ring and gave it to the Druids, imagining white-robed priests who read the year from trilithons and spilled blood upon the altar stone. John Aubrey and William Stukeley traced lines upon the turf and dreamed a Celtic temple. It was a romance born from ignorance, for the Druids belonged to a later age, and the circle was old long before any Roman scribe wrote of oak groves and sacrifices. Yet the dream lingers still because it is easier to people the stones with priests than with farmers who raised pigs and brought cattle and loved their dead. When science turned its gaze to the henge, the stones were drawn into a different kind of myth, one made of numbers and angles. In the middle of the last century, an astronomer stood among the uprights with a transit and a table of rising points, and he saw in the rectangle of the station stones a pattern that might count the long swing of the moon across the sky in. A cycle of about 18.5 years. Gerald Hawkins ran calculations and declared that Stonehenge could predict eclipses, igniting a brief hope that the ring was an observatory as exact as a modern dome. His work was bold and his instruments keen, but later scholars warned that a monument can hold many lines if one searches long enough, and that a few good alignments to the sun do not make a machine that numbers the heavens. The consensus returned to what the sunrise and sunset on solstice days have shouted all along. Stonehenge is a place that binds the year, not a planetarium. It may have kept a kind of calendar by eye and procession, but only the sun on the longest morning and the shortest evening pierces the heart of the ring with a certainty that endures from then to now. Debate lives not only in the sky, but in the earth beneath the stones. The smaller pillars of blue and grey from the far hills of Preseli are a riddle that has sharpened with new knowledge. The old question asks if people hold them by hand with sledges and rafts and stubborn will, or if ice carried them part way during the deep cold of a forgotten age and left them scattered as erratics to be gathered later. The case for human transport is strong in the minds of those who have traced the scars of quarrying on Welsh outcrops and matched the stone there to pillars on the plain. Others still see the hand of glaciers shaping the supply and think the builders collected what the ice had delivered. A newer thought adds another layer. On a Pembrokeshire hillside, a circle of sockets was found that seems to match the diameter of the earliest known setting at Stonehenge, and some imagine a ring dismantled in the west and raised again in the east, as if a community carried the bones of its sacred place to a new home. The idea is stirring and the evidence suggestive rather than final, and so the matter remains open like a gate half closed against the evening wind. The great Sarsens invite their own arguments, though here the trail of fact has grown clearer. For many years, no one could say with confidence which outcrops on the downs gave birth to the tallest uprights and their broad lintels. Then a core taken from a trilithon during restoration work in the late 1950s found its way back to curators in our time, and the chemistry of its grain was compared to the wide scatter of Sarsen boulders across southern Britain. The fingerprint led not to some distant ridge but to the woods a day's march to the north. West Woods, on the Marlborough Downs, now speaks as the mother of most of the great stones, which means the haul was long but not impossible. That finding also pleases the sense of a people who drew their monument from the very chalk country that sustained them, binding the ring to its landscape with more than sight lines and processional ditches. Meaning has always been the deepest quarrel. What was Stonehenge for? The earliest phases make a cemetery, plain and simple, a white ring of chalk that guarded cremation burials in the Aubrey holes and perhaps marked a place where the living called to the dead. Later, the architecture turned to stone and to the long axis that binds solstice dawn to solstice dusk. Some archaeologists argue that the bluestones had a special power and that the ring drew pilgrims who sought healing. Others see a theatre of ancestor and son where processions moved between timber circles at Durrington Walls, a place of the living and feasting, and the stone circle across the river, a place of the dead and memory. The river was the clean line between warmth and stillness, and the avenue up from the Avon was a formal path where the seasons themselves seemed to walk. Still others argue for Stonehenge as a monument of unification, a great work built to knit scattered groups into a single people after conflict had shaken the land. The evidence reaches toward these readings without closing a fist around any one of them. The cremations tell of death and care. The feasting middens at Durrington tell of midwinter abundance and distant journeys. The alignments tell of love for the turning year. It may be that Stonehenge was all of these at once, its meanings layered like chalk and turf, shifting as generations reset stones and renewed vows. There is also the matter of how much of what we see is original stance and how much is the hand of modern caretakers. In the early 20th century, men in tweed and boots raised fallen uprights with cranes and set lintels back upon their shouldered tenons. William Gowland straightened stones in 1901. William Hawley dug trenches and mapped the first plan after the Great War. In the late 1950s, more trilithons were lifted from their beds and braced with concrete to keep them true against the long weather. Some visitors imagine that the circle has slept as it stands since the Bronze Age. In truth, it has been tended and corrected and, at times, clumsily helped. None of that robs it of age or meaning. It does remind us that every generation has rewritten the site a little, and that the duty of stewardship sits beside the duty of restraint. The legacy of Stonehenge reaches far beyond the chalk. It shaped the very birth of archaeology in Britain, drawing antiquarians to measure and draw and dream and then to dig. It taught scholars to separate lore from layer and to trust the soil more than the story. It helped to make a science out of patience. It also remains a living place. On solstice mornings, a crowd gathers in the grey light, a tide of people who want to stand where the longest day begins and feel the sun climb through the notch of stone. Some wear white robes and wreaths of leaves and speak of druids in a spirit of gentle play. Some come for the photograph. Some come for a quiet that is hard to find in cities. The managers of the site must balance this longing with the ache of preservation. For each footstep wears the chalk, and each hand on a sarsen leaves a trace of oil. The circle belongs to the world and to the people who live in its shadow. Holding both truths is work as delicate as any lintel joint. So the debates continue, but the stones keep their counsel. The wizard and the devil have departed the plane. The druids have retreated to the age that birthed them. The eclipse computer has given way to the old certainty that the sun on 2 days each year completes the monument. What remains is a circle that ties death to memory, people to place, and season to season. It is a hinge of the year and a hinge of the mind. It reminds us that farmers and herders with antler picks and wooden sledges could shape a landscape that still orders our thoughts 3,000 years later. In that recognition, there is a quiet reverence that feels more honest than any enchantment. The desert of southern Peru is a canvas the color of sun-baked iron, a vast and level pampa where the wind passes softly and rain seldom remembers to fall. Here the earth wears a dark skin of pebbles stained by ages of sun and air, each stone burnished with a reddish varnish that turns the landscape into a rough mirror. Beneath that dark crust, the ground is pale, a powder of gypsum and sand that gleams when exposed. On this high and arid plain between the valleys of Nazca and Palpa, across the Pampa Colorada and the neighboring pampas that lift toward the Andean foothills, the people we call Nazca drew upon the land itself. They did not build walls or raise columns. They did something stranger. They took away rather than added. With patient hands, they scraped aside the dark stones along lines set by stakes and cords, revealing the pale underworld of the soil so that light and shadow would inscribe shapes that no storm could easily erase. In a place where clouds are rare and the crust is hard and the air is dry as bone, the drawings endured. They still endure. From ground level, the marks can seem like nothing more than faint tracks that wander without purpose. The truth gathers when the eye climbs a hillside or when the traveler goes up in the air. Then the plain opens as if a curtain were drawn. Straight lines run across the pampa for kilometers without wavering, so taut they might have been plucked like strings. Trapezoids widen like banners, triangles and rectangles lie set upon the open earth, and among these geometric fields appear living figures. There is a hummingbird with a needle beak that measures near 100 meters from tip to tail, its wings spread in a perfect sweep. There is a spider with thin legs splayed with such grace that each line keeps its width from start to finish. There is a monkey whose tail curls into a tight spiral. There are whales and pelicans and a condor with a long bent neck and a pair of human-like hands with 4 and 5 fingers carved near the Panamericana Road. On a slope above the plain stands a round-eyed figure with raised arm, the so-called astronaut who looks more like a mythic watcher peering out from the hills. More than 70 animal and plant forms have been counted, hundreds of geometric shapes, and many hundreds of straight lines. Some are small enough to be seen from a nearby ridge. Others vanish into distance and can only be grasped from the sky. Archaeology tells us the makers worked between roughly the last centuries before Christ and the early centuries after, the span in which the Nazca culture flourished on the irrigated river valleys that cut through this desert. Before them, people of the Paracas tradition had already traced smaller geoglyphs upon hillsides, and in the early Nazca period the art leaped in scale and number. The desert keeps the evidence because it is gentle to what is written upon it. Where the dark pebbles are cleared, the paler soil beneath is bound by dew and heat into a crust that resists the wind. Because there is so little rain, the pale scars do not wash away. Because the climate is steady, the exposed ground does not darken quickly. Where modern feet or tires have trespassed, the wounds are obvious for all to see, which is why the guardians of the Pampa now patrol and mark the safe crossings so that the ancient lines can still lie quiet. The method is simple and at the same time exact. Along many lines, archaeologists have found the holes where wooden stakes once stood. In a few places, the desert yielded the stakes themselves, hardened and preserved by dryness, their fibers dated by radiocarbon to the Nazca centuries. With stakes set to define ends and angles, cords could be stretched to guide the cut. The groove that defines a line is often no deeper than the span from fingertip to first knuckle, and the width varies from the breadth of a hand to the width of a small road. The makers scraped with stone tools and perhaps with wooden blades, lifting the dark pebbles aside and piling them in low berms on either flank. In this way they turned absence into figure. For curves and animal forms, surveyors could enlarge a small drawing by means of a simple grid drawn on the ground with cords and stakes, a technique that people everywhere have used to scale images for wall or floor. On the pampa, this grid becomes a ghost the desert later swallows, leaving the clean edge of a hummingbird's wing or the unbroken turn of a monkey's spiral. When modern researchers tried the same with a small crew and simple tools, the earth yielded to their lines in a matter of days, proof that the ancient method rests on geometry, patience, and good eyes. If the lines were drawn upon a blank slate, the culture that made them was anything but blank. The Nazca valleys were green with canals and fields fed by ingenious underground aqueducts called puquios, where spiral openings drop into cool shafts that carry water from aquifers to the surface. The people painted their pottery with bright slips in colors of red and cream and black and yellow, and upon those vessels they drew the same figures that walk the pampa. Hummingbirds and whales and monkeys, spiders and serpents, masked faces and stylized plants appear on bowls and cups that came from household and grave. The textiles that survive are embroidered with similar forms and with signs that speak to fertility and rain and the powers that govern them. Trophy heads appear in the art of Nazca as well, a grim symbol that speaks to rites we do not fully understand. All of this reveals a world that took the spirits of animals and the order of the seasons seriously, a world where dry land had to be coaxed to yield life, where water was a god one had to court, and where the sky was a roof that listened. The surface of the pampa itself preserves the touch of the makers, as if time were loath to smooth it away. On some trapezoids there are cairns and little mounds of stones that may have been left as offerings. At certain crossings of lines, fragments of broken pottery lie as if vessels were smashed there at the end of a procession. The geometric fields are not empty decoration. On their hard, pale floors, the feet of ancient walkers have scuffed faint paths, gentle scars that suggest that people entered along one side, traced a route, and left by another, as if these were processional courts. In a few instances, one can see how a straight line cuts through an older figure and continues, which tells us that the drawing on the earth was not frozen in a single moment, but renewed through generations with changing choices and perhaps changing meanings. The desert, being dry, remembers every revision. The first eyes from beyond the culture to grasp the full spectacle belong to travelers of our own time. In the early 20th century, a Peruvian scholar named Toribio Mejia Cespe walked the hills and noted lines that seemed to make sense only from above. In the year when war burned across the oceans, a young American named Paul Kosok flew over the pampa in a small plane at sunset and watched how the day died along a straight geoglyph that pointed toward the place where the sun met the earth. He called the land a great book. A German mathematician named Maria Reich came soon after and made the plane her life. She lived in Nazca, measured lines in the heat, mapped the shapes with care, slept on the pampa to guard it, and wrote guides to help others see. Whether one agrees with all her conclusions or not, her devotion is written today in the fact that the lines still exist to be studied and protected. In the last generation, cameras on drones and careful survey from the air have revealed new figures hidden beneath the dust and hard to see from the ground, including small animals scratched upon the dark slopes above the plain, proof that the desert has not yielded all its drawings even now. The truth of these geoglyphs begins in what can be touched and measured. They are the deliberate work of a people who knew their land and sky and who found a way to make their prayers or their promises large enough to be seen by the gods. They pulled the skin of the earth aside and let the pale bones shine. They matched figures on the ground to figures in their art and laid out courts big enough to walk a ritual under the open Sunday. They selected a place where weather would conspire to keep their labor legible for centuries, and they set their marks where the horizon runs clean. In a world that has changed, the pampa has changed little. That is why the lines still speak. Mystery draws theories as surely as the desert draws heat, and the great plain of Nazca has become a board where many ideas have been set like stones. The first and most enchanting of these is the lure of the sky. When Paul Kosok watched a winter sun die along a straight geoglyph, he felt that the land itself was a calendar, and Maria Reich gave a lifetime to the notion that the figures and lines spoke the language of stars. She walked and measured and slept among the stones, tracing alignments with the rising and setting of sun and moon and bright stars, and she believed that hummingbird and spider and monkey were part of a cosmic book that could be read in the firmament. There are indeed lines that answer the sun at the turning of the year. There are directions that do meet the solstice and the equinox with a precision that is hard to ignore. Yet careful surveys and hard arithmetic have shown that the forest of lines is too dense to make the sky its only master. If one draws enough lines across a wide horizon, some will meet a sunrise by chance, and if one seeks star risings across all ages of precession, then many matches can be made. The truth that remains after the romance is that certain geoglyphs face the sun on sacred days, that some lines do bind land to heaven, and that a general calendar sense is present. But the plain refuses to be only an observatory. It asks to be walked as much as it asks to be watched. Walkers have left their traces, as light as breath. Archaeologists found broken pots at the nodes where lines cross, a scatter of sherds, as if a vessel had been dashed at the completion of a rite. On the broad trapezoids, faint paths crisscross like threads, the wear of many feet entering at one side and departing at another, a choreography written by souls and not by stars. The Nazca did not live on the pampa. They lived in irrigated valleys where water was coaxed from the earth by means of pukios, those spiraling shafts that drop into cool tunnels cut to tap aquifers, a genius of stone and gravity that still serves farmers today. When one considers a people who won their bread from a desert with canals that run underground like secret rivers, it is not hard to hear in the geoglyphs the rhythms of supplication and thanksgiving. In the figures, scholars see the language of rain and growth. The hummingbird appears when flowers bloom and so becomes a messenger of fertility. The spider in Andean lore loves the damp and is a herald of wet seasons. The whale and pelican invoke the sea that sends clouds and fish. The snake is a water spirit that moves like a stream. In that world, the plain becomes a place where ritual petitions were made large and where processions might draw the gods' eyes to the need of a people who asked the sky to enter the earth. Some thinkers have looked beyond the Nazca valleys to wider Andean patterns and found echoes in a web of sacred lines that once radiated from the capital at Cuzco. There, in a time later than Nazca, lines called seques ran from the Temple of the Sun to shrines in the surrounding hills, a sacred geography that laced the city to its country. Though the peoples and periods differ, the idea that ritual lines map a landscape of holy places lends a frame to Nazca. The geoglyphs may have tied springs and hills and ancient shrines into a network that pilgrims traced under the open sky. The straight lines which seem to point to nothing today may once have pointed to a post or a cairn or a bundle of offerings that has been removed by time and wind. The power of a line need not lie in its target at the horizon, but in the act of walking it with song and gifts. There is another kind of story that the desert has had to endure, a tale that looks for visitors who came from very far indeed. The round-eyed figure on the hillside has been called an astronaut in the chatter of modern myth, and long straight geoglyphs have been described as runways for impossible craft. This is an easy tale to tell, and a poor one. It ignores the stake holes that mark a surveyor's work. It ignores the preserved stakes whose dates fall cleanly within the Nazca centuries. It ignores the simple beauty of a grid scaled by cord and stake, and the way a line carved by many hands can stay straight for miles, because the human eye is good, and the ground is flat, and the wind is kind. Human minds and bodies drew these images. That truth honors the makers far more than any fantasy of strangers from the sky, and it leaves us with a mystery more worthy of respect. For it asks what within a human community makes such labor valuable enough to be repeated for generations. The legacy of the lines is written not only in theories, but in the stubborn fact that they still exist. The desert has been their ally and their shelter, yet even an arid plain can be wounded. In the 20th century, a ribbon of modern road cut across the pampa and clipped an ancient figure of hands at the edge of the tarmac, a careless scar that teaches that progress without care can be blind. In one foolish moment on a windswept morning, a group of protesters stamped letters on the soil near the hummingbird and left footprints that will last beyond their cause. In another careless act, a heavy truck left the safety of the highway and plowed tracks across the crust that will take years of wind to soften. The guardians of the site have fenced and marked and built watchtowers and small platforms, and they send drones to scan the slopes where small figures hide. The world at large has given the lines a shield in the form of a place on the list of treasures all nations vow to protect. Yet the best protection remains knowledge and respect, for a single footstep on the wrong soil can undo a century of preservation. Even as the pampa suffers the odd wound, it continues to yield quiet gifts. New figures have come to light where dark slopes meet pale sky. A cat stretched along a hillside appeared when the earth was cleaned of loose stones, a creature drawn with a casual grace that belongs to the earliest hands. A parade of small animals and human-like forms has been traced by patient eyes peering from above, some of them so faint that only the angle of a low sun reveals them. Digital eyes have learned to read the skin of the desert and to catch what the human eye misses, and so the count of geoglyphs rises. Each new discovery adds a note to the old music. It confirms that the making of images was an art continued across centuries, and that the plain is not a single message but a library. In the end, the debate returns to the same center. What did the Nazca want the gods to see? The answer is not one thing. It is not only the sunrise, it is not only the path of rain. It is not only the signature of a clan or the pride of artisans. It is a whole world placed upon the ground. It is people marking a covenant with forces larger than themselves, who made their prayers as large as their landscape and found a place where those prayers would last. That is why the geoglyphs still move us. They are not portraits of animals only. They are portraits of a people speaking with the earth. We look down from planes and think of our vantage as godlike, yet the true audience may always have been the powers the Nazca believed walked the sky. The sea keeps its own museums, shelves of silt and stone where whole rooms of history lie in the dark. At the turn of a new century, a storm drove sponge divers to shelter near a small Greek island called Antikythera, a rugged step of rock between Crete and the Peloponnese, where the water drops to a blue that swallows ships. When the weather gentled, the men went down in their great canvas suits with helmets of brass and glass and walked the seabed with lead upon their boots. One came up wide-eyed and stammering of statues that were not statues, but men with the skin of the sea. The word brought others down. There, on a slope about 45 meters deep, they found the bones of a Roman-era merchantman strewn in a field of amphorae and marble torsos and bronze faces grown green with centuries. Over many months, the Greek authorities hauled wonders to the surface, a drowned gallery that had slept since the age of Cicero. Among the treasure was a lump of corroded bronze and rotted wood that no one noticed at first, a crusted brick, the color of old olives. It sat quiet until a conservator pried at it, and a plate broke away to show the jagged rim of a gear. In that cut circle, the modern world felt a shiver. The sea had given back a machine. The ship that carried it had gone down in the 1st century before Christ, most likely in the reign of the last Roman Republic, but the mechanism itself was older by a generation or two. The letter forms on its plates and the style of its inscriptions point to the 2nd century before Christ, to a literate workshop in the Greek world that could marry craft to astronomy and write the marriage upon bronze. Over time, the corrosion broke the device into dozens of fragments. In the end, about 80 pieces were counted, some no larger than a coin, some the size of a hand, and one great fragment that preserves a tight stack of gears like a city of wheels. The whole, when it lived, was housed in a wooden case about the size of a thick book, with hinged doors that bore long texts on their inner faces. Texts that read like a guide for the user and a promise of the heavens the machine could show. On the front were circular dials with scale rings for the familiar zodiac and for a civil calendar of 365 days. On the back were spirals cut into bronze, coiled scales that counted months and years according to cycles known from the star watchers of Babylon and the geometers of Greece. To turn the device was to wind time. A small handle would have driven a train of bronze teeth that were cut fine and close, teeth so small that some measure only a few millimeters from point to point, evidence that the maker had files of great delicacy and a patience to match. As the crank turned, pointers on the front face carried small symbols of the sun and the moon along the zodiac, and a little ball half dark and half bright rotated to show the changing face of the moon as it waxed and waned. Along the edge, a calendar ring ticked through the days and months, likely the Egyptian-style civil count that many Greek astronomers used as a neat yardstick for calculation. Around the front, there were also tiny star names and month markers of a parapegma, that is, a practical sky almanac which told the reader when bright stars would rise at dawn or set at dusk, signs by which farmers and sailors once guided their work. The back of the machine was a deeper labyrinth of time. The larger spiral dial tracked the 19-year metonic cycle by which 235 lunar months returned to near the same place in the solar year. The smaller subsidiary dial above it counted the 76-year Calippic cycle, 4 metonic turns bound into a larger harmony that improved the measure. Below, another spiral counted the 223 months of the Saros cycle by which eclipses return. Along that spiral, small letters sit by month marks like the marginalia of a scholar. They tell the kind of eclipse to expect and the hour, and sometimes they add a note that the moon would turn a copper color, as if the maker wished to add a touch of drama to the calculation. Beside the Saros, a tiny dial recorded the exeligmos, 3 Saros cycles together, a grand reckoning of just over 54 years that corrected the drift of hours. To stand before that back face and imagine the pointers crawling is to see a clock with the soul of a calendar with the mind of an astronomer. Within the bronze body, the gearwork embodies cleverness that speaks a name without writing it. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus of Nicaea had wrestled with the problem that the moon does not move evenly around the Earth. It speeds and slows according to where it is in its path, The mechanism answers this with a pin and slot arrangement that sits at the heart of one gear train. As the wheels turn, a pin running in a slot moves a small wheel off-center and then back again, producing a slow pulse that speeds and slackens the lunar hand so that it mimics the irregular dance of the real moon. No text survives that says Hipparchus designed the gearing, yet the mathematics match his lunar theory. At the least, the maker was heir to the school of Rhodes and to the tradition of scholars who measured sky with naked eyes and then taught their numbers to metal. There is a trace of the living hand not only in the gears, but in the letters. Computed tomography in our age has read inscriptions that human eyes could not reach, dense paragraphs in a fine Greek script packed into the very corrosion. They list lunar and solar cycles, they name festivals and games dear to Greeks, and they describe what the dials do. Some rows catalogue eclipses with symbols for wind and color, as if to prepare the observer for omens the sky would show. Others are a star calendar in prose, noting the days when bright stars appear before sunrise or vanish at dusk. The texts make the device less mysterious and more human. It was not a puzzle box meant to hide secret knowledge. It was a teaching instrument and a working calendar, a portable cosmos for a man who had friends to impress or students to guide. The box that held it was probably of a hard wood and may once have been painted or polished, the bronze faces shining like a mirror under oil. Turn the crank and a world would move at your command. The complexity tells us plainly that this was not the first of its kind. The skill to cut those teeth and mesh those wheels does not spring from the bronze like Athena from the head of Zeus. It grows in a workshop over years, in the hands of a master who learned from another master. We can safely imagine precursors in wood that have rotted to nothing, and perhaps cousins in bronze that lie in wrecks, still undiscovered. We can also see in the cargo of the ship that carried it a clue to its home. The wreck was laden with statues and luxury goods, likely gathered in the Greek world, and bound for Roman taste. Coins and styles point to Rhodes and to the Eastern Aegean, places famous for schools of astronomy and for the kind of craftsman who could make a clock that did not yet have a name. There is a piece of romance in the way the machine returned to us. For decades after the first study by a bold scholar who died too soon, the fragments sat in the museum while the public marveled at the bronzes and marble statues that stood gleaming in their halls. Then, in our time, a new alliance of physicists and epigraphers and historians turned new eyes upon the green lumps. Computed tomography unrolled the layers of corrosion like a scroll and showed hidden teeth and unseen letters. High-resolution photography under raking light revealed faint strokes and numbers. The scholars built models in metal and in thought. They argued gear counts and pointer paths and the exact layout of the front dials. Some reconstructions put 5 planetary hands on the front in addition to the sun and the moon, each driven by its own set of wheels to mimic the ancient planets. Others keep a more modest face where only sun and moon and a star calendar make their rounds. What is certain, even when details are debated, is the purpose. The device gathers cycles taken from Babylonian arithmetic and Greek geometry and sets them into a single choreography of bronze. Hold in the mind for a moment the person who turned the handle. He stands in a colonnaded courtyard or in the corner of a small study, with light from a window tracing a bright line across the dial. A friend asks when the next eclipse will come, and the man turns the spiral of Saros with his finger and reads the little letters and names the month and the hour. He shows a boy how the moon will be fat and pale on a certain night in winter and thin as a curled shaving in a month of heat. He speaks the names of the games that the small dial lists, Olympia and Nemea and Pythia, and smiles at the whimsy of a cosmos that remembers wrestling bouts as well as seasons. In that moment, the machine is not an isolated marvel. It is the embodiment of a culture that loved proportion and number, and that took joy in binding the order of the sky to the order of a city calendar. The wreck that brought it to us was a tragedy in its day and a fortune in ours. Bronze hates the sea, and the sea hates all memory except the memory it chooses to keep. That the gears survived at all seems like grace. They came to a museum in Athens and were cleaned and conserved and studied until the fragments could be named and placed. The largest is called by a simple letter, and around it the others have been mapped and recorded, an atlas of an ancient device. Replicas now turn on tables in galleries where crowds gather in front of glass and watch pale pointers chase one another across a painted zodiac. The quiet click of modern bronze teeth speaks across 2,000 years, and in that sound one hears the truth that the gulf between their knowledge and ours is narrower than pride would claim. From the moment a corroded plate gave up the tooth of a gear, the object has lived in an arena of rival explanations, each careful as a goldsmith and each tested against a stubborn body of metal and letters. In the middle of the last century, a historian of science peered through early radiographs and wrote that Greece had hidden a world of wheels within its philosophy. He gave the fragments a coherent heart and called his study a message from the ancients. Later, an engineer rebuilt the device with patient hands and brass files, insisting that only a working model can answer a working question. Then our own century sent light into the bronze with computed tomography and drew out whole paragraphs from inside the corrosion, along with the ghosts of unseen gear teeth. A team of physicists and classicists and epigraphers read those letters by raking light and digital lens and declared that the machine predicted eclipses and tracked a lunisolar calendar with an elegance that no one had dared to expect. The argument since has not been whether it computed, but how far the computation went and how the makers arranged the orchestra of wheels within a case no larger than a scholar's book. The most tantalizing quarrel is over the planets. Everyone agrees that the front face carried the sun and the moon, and that a small sphere showed the moon's changing light, and everyone agrees that the back spirals recited cycles by which eclipses return like tides. But inscriptions also whisper of the periods of the bright wanderers, and a few lines seem to name Venus and Saturn among them. From that seed, some have grown a full face of planetary pointers, each driven by epicyclic trains that would mimic the slow loops of ancient astronomy. A bold reconstruction from a London workshop of the mind has shown how to fold those trains into two slim plates of gears and still leave room for the lunar trick that speeds and slows the moon by a pin riding a slot. Others raise a hand and ask how such density survives within the wooden box that the sea half preserved, and whether the surviving posts and plates leave enough space for every ambition. They point to broken axes and empty screw holes, and say that the safest reading is Lena, a cosmos of sun and moon and stars, with the planets confined to text. This is not a quarrel of camps who refuse evidence. It is a cautious dance at the edge of what corrosion allows. Another dispute concerns the date to which the machine was calibrated. The eclipse spiral is not a generic wheel of months. It begins at a chosen moment so that its little letters fall upon months where darkness truly came. Scholars have matched those notes to the known catalogue of eclipses and proposed candidate years in the early 2nd century before Christ, when the series fits most neatly. One date places the start of the cycle near the time when a great astronomer was at work on Rhodes. Another, slightly later date gives a better run of lunar events, but raises questions about the age of the letter forms. The mechanism itself is older than the ship that carried it to the bottom, but how much older remains an argument in which sky and script and style all have a voice. Provenance draws its own net. The lettering is Greek and speaks with a regional accent that has been read as close to Corinthian by some and as Aegean by others. The calendar on the front uses the tidy civil count that many Greek astronomers favored for calculation, and the parapegma of stellar risings reads like a pocket almanac made for sailors and farmers as much as for philosophers. On a subsidiary dial, the names of games unwind with the years. Olympia in Elis and Pythia at Delphi and Nemea and the Isthmian contests, and even other festivals that hint at loyalties farther east. All of this invites Rhodes, that island of schools and observatories and clockmakers, a place where a statesman could commission a curiosity to delight his dinner companions and instruct his sons. Yet other cities have their claim in the imagination. Pergamon, with its library and its court of kings, loved instruments. Syracuse had a legend of a sage who built a sphere that showed the heavens. No inscription gives us an address. The most honest answer is that the mechanism was born in the workshop of a learned artisan in a Greek city where astronomy was a living practice and where patrons paid for marvels. There is a thread that ties the machine to a long tradition, and that thread has become a rope in modern storytelling. A Roman orator wrote that he had seen a device at Rome that could show the motions of sun, moon, and planets, a work he attributed to a famous mathematician of Sicily. Readers since have joined that passage to the wreck off Antikythera and declared that the bronze cogs in Athens are the great man's own. The pleasure of that identification is obvious, but the evidence is air. What we can say is that the mathematical scheme inside the lunar gearing matches the theory of a certain astronomer, and that the Hellenistic world did not keep calculation in books alone. Whether the hand that filed these teeth belonged to a student of that school is a question that may never rise from the silt. Another debate touches the word by which the public loves the object. Is it fair to call this an analog computer? Some worry that the word is a modern idol that demands powers the bronze never claimed. Others answer that the term describes method rather than era, that to encode cycles as ratios of toothed wheels and to produce predicted states as output is to compute in metal, and that the name gives the lay reader a bridge to understanding. The truth is that language will bend to fame. School children will hear that long before engines and electricity, a Greek box could tell eclipses and moon phases and the time of festival, and they will be right enough. If the arguments sharpen our sense of what the device was, its legacy lies in what it has done to us. It has changed the way we think about the reach of Hellenistic craft. Once we drew a straight road from gears in the mills of the Middle Ages to clocks on cathedral towers, and then to the escapements of pocket watches, and we kept the ancients standing on the side of that road as spectators. Now we know that hands in a Greek workshop cut teeth so fine they still catch the light 2,000 years later, and that a teacher in a port city could invite his friends to watch the heavens turn on a desk. That recognition has made historians ask new questions about what else has been lost. It has made engineers look at old texts with fresh eyes. It has sent divers back to the wreck with closed-circuit breathers and mapping sonars and patient grids. Those return expeditions have found more of the ship's story. Bronze limbs of statues have been brought up with their muscles still perfect beneath a skin of green. Marble heads have looked at the sun again with blank eyes. And the floor of the site has been mapped as if it were a city block. On one season, a human skeleton was found among the amphorae, and conservators lifted bones that may still hold a whisper of a name within their spirals. A small lead disc pierced by holes set some hearts racing until it proved to be the ornament of a robe rather than a cog. These finds do not add new gears to the mechanism, but they add the feel of a deck underfoot and the weight of a cargo in a swell. They remind us that the box of wheels traveled among statues and bowls and coins, and that it sank with men who belonged to a crew and a culture. Museums have turned the fragments into ambassadors. Behind glass in Athens, the green pieces sit under soft light, while nearby, a working model turns in a case and visitors watch bright pointers circle a painted zodiac. The tick of modern teeth seems almost sacrilegious beside the silence of the original, but the lesson is kind. The device speaks most clearly when it moves. Replicas turn now in science centers and universities. Craft workers have learned to cut small teeth by hand and to lap brass until it purrs. Students trace the Saros with a finger and learn that eclipses come not by omen, but by number. In that way, the box has become again what it once was, a teacher. To ask why the tradition did not fill the Roman world with clockwork is to ask why history so often mislays its cleverness. Perhaps these devices were rare and expensive and served a circle too tight to survive a century of change. Perhaps workshops burned or were dispersed by war. Perhaps the knowledge lived in wood that decayed and in bronze that was melted for coin. What we can say is that a spark that leaped in the Greek 2nd century before Christ smoldered in texts and tales until it flared again in the towns of Europe in the centuries after 1000, when towers began to keep the hours for cities. The mechanism of Antikythera shows that the gap between those fires is not emptiness, but loss. Even with its disputes and lacunae, the device has given certainty where before there were only dreams and dismissals. It has forced the world to admit that an age of poets and philosophers could also be an age of instrument makers. It has shown that there is a straight line from a finger that traces a star's first rising on a temple wall to a pointer that sweeps across a scale engraved with the same star's name. In that recognition, there is a kind of reconciliation between romance and reason. We can keep our sense of wonder and give it better food. Far out on the blue plains of the Pacific, where the horizon is a ring of water and the wind tastes of salt and sun, a small island rises from 3 old volcanoes and carries on its slopes a forest of stone faces. Rapa Nui is the name the people give their home. Easter Island is the name it carries on maps made elsewhere. From the air, its shape is like a spearhead. From the sea, its cliffs stand dark and sudden. Along those coasts and across the grassy flanks, the Moai keep their silence. They are tall and intent, long-nosed and heavy-browed, their lips pressed to a line, their shoulders squared, as if answering a roll call taken by ancestors. Most stand on ceremonial platforms the islanders call ahu, with paved courts of beach cobbles before them and the ocean at their backs, while their gaze turns inland over the places where the living once cooked and slept and planted. To walk among them at dawn is to feel a presence both solemn and intimate, as if the island itself were a house of memory and the statues the elders who refuse to forget. The story begins with sailors who were not lost. Polynesian navigators left marks upon the sea that were not written in ink, but in the rise and fall of swells, the flight of birds, the pattern of stars at certain hours. In the centuries after the first millennium, those master seafarers crossed a world without iron or compass and reached this small triangle of land set far from every shore. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal and bone, and the first traces of gardens tell of settlement around the 13th century of our era. And within a few generations, the island had become a web of clans with sacred places and shared rules. They brought plants that fed them, and animals that multiplied in coops and pens. They learned the moods of the currents and the winds, and the places on the reef where fish were plenty. They named the headlands and the quarries and the bays. Then, in the 13th and 14th centuries, they began to pull giants from the slope of a mountain. That mountain is Rano Raraku, an old volcano cut by a crater whose flanks are made of grey tuff that yields to the blow of a stone pick and hardens in the sunday. The makers chose this rock as a carver chooses a block of wood. If one walks there today, one finds a workshop left in place by time itself. Faces lie half-freed in the quarry wall. Bodies sleep in the ground, with only heads showing to the wind, though excavations prove that the buried part is a full torso sunk by centuries of slope wash. Tools of dark basalt called toki lie where they fell from tired hands. Deep grooves show where a carver laid out a profile with confident strokes. The process can be read from the stone. A team traced the outline of a statue flat upon the bedrock and carved it face up until the front and sides were complete. A spine of rock remained along the back so that the figure still clung to the mountain like a child to its mother. Trenches were cut beneath to release it at last, and the moai was slid down on a bedding of grass and levered upright to be finished. Only then were the deep sockets for the eyes cut into the face. The islanders carved more than 800 of these figures in different sizes and styles over 3 centuries, and though each is kin to the others, each is also a person. Some are broad-shouldered and massive. Some are slim and high-cheeked. A few carry delicate hands laid across the belly. Names once belonged to them as names belong to elders, for the statues embodied the mana of ancestors who could see and bless and protect. The moai were not complete until they stood upon an ahu. Building a platform was a feat of masonry as serious as the carving itself. Ahus are long low terraces set near the sea, made of cut stone laid in faces so neat that a fingertip can follow the joints without finding a gap. The core is packed with rubble, and the outer walls are of carefully selected blocks. A ramp often falls away seaward. Before the platform, a plaza of rounded beach stones gleams when it rains, a place for ceremony and offerings and the work of priests. Upon the top course, sockets receive the feet of statues, and the fit is so exact that many moai still stand, despite long centuries of wind and tremor. In the later phases, an additional adornment crowned some of the greatest ancestors. From the red scoria quarry of Punapau, artisans cut great cylinders and domes that were set on the heads of chosen moai. These are called pukau, often described as top knots or headdresses, their red color catching the light like fire at sunset. When a statue was placed and its eyes were carved, inlays of white coral with a pupil of black obsidian or red scoria were set into the sockets in a rite that woke the stone. In that moment, the ancestor was not simply a likeness. He was a presence that watched the fields and the hearths and received the offerings of his people. The question of movement has always tugged at the mind. How did figures that weigh as much as a dozen oxen travel from the central quarry to the ring of platforms around the coast? The island itself keeps a record. Ancient roads run in soft curves from Rano Raraku toward the sea. Along those roads lie statues fallen on their faces, abandoned where balance failed or where some change halted a journey. Their bases are not flat. They are beveled and slightly rounded, and many torsos tilt forward as if born to lean into motion. Generations ago, the islanders told visiting scholars that the ancestors walked to their resting places. For a long time, the remark was taken as poetry. Experiments on the ground have given the words a practical truth. With ropes tied to a standing replica and teams on either side pulling in rhythm, while a third line controlled the lean from behind, a moai can be rocked and pivoted and persuaded to take short steps along a prepared path. The movement is slow and strangely graceful, a careful dance where the statue sways and then settles forward onto its toes. The shape of the base and the forward lean help the motion. This does not rule out sledges in earlier times or the use of logs to pad and pry, but the islanders' own metaphor of walking has proven to be a key as much as a story. The greatest of the moai invite superlatives. The tallest erected is a giant close to 10 meters, a weight that men today can only lift with the help of engines. There is a larger one still, left half-made in the quarry, more than twice a man in height again, a work that would have weighed as much as a blue whale if it had ever been freed. The catalogue kept by patient scholars counts nearly 900 statues in all, of which well over 100 stand upon platforms, with many more asleep on the slopes of the mountain or lying along the roads of their intended journeys. Some backs carry petroglyphs carved later in the island story, birds and symbols cut with a light hand that speak of new rites layered upon old stones. A few moai once wore painted patterns, traces of mineral color clinging in protected hollows. Every detail that survives widens the sense that these were not idols thrown up in haste, but the careful work of a culture that knew how to plan and how to honor. The making of statues and platforms demanded more than skill. It required food and rope and timber and time. The evidence of gardens and fields shows that the islanders answered those demands with ingenuity. In a land where soil is thin and wind is sharp, they built rock mulches to trap moisture and warmth around the roots of sweet potatoes and taro and banana. They planted in protected enclosures where stone walls broke the wind and caught dew. They pried fresh basalt from quarries to chip into tools and made lashing from bark and fiber that could hold a giant steady. The organization implicit in such works appears again in the remains of villages near the platforms and in the bones within the ahu that hold the honored dead. The moai were not solitary wonders, but the visible crest of a whole economy and a faith. There is a ritual geography to the island that reveals itself when one follows the line of the coast. Platforms come in clusters where clans held sway, and each cluster faces inward toward the lands of the living. On the southern headland called Orongo, high above the sea, houses of thin stone slabs lie in a row near the lip of the great crater of Rano Kau, and petroglyphs of a man with a bird head crowd, the rocks, signs of a later ceremony that rose when the age of the moai was waning. That story belongs to another part of our tale, when the focus of power shifted and old statues fell. But even here at the beginning, the island itself hints that time would change the balance of belief. For now it is enough to stand on the seaward side of an ahu at evening and watch the last light wash the faces of giants who look toward their people. The wind moves in the grasses. The surf throws white lace against black lava. Behind you the ancestors do not speak, but their shadow falls long upon the fields, and in that shadow one feels the weight of promise and obligation that bound the living to the dead. Stories cling to Rapa Nui like salt to the rocks, and for a long time the loudest story was a parable of folly. It told that the islanders cut every tree to feed a fever for statues, that the soil slipped, that the canoes rotted away, that famine and war pulled down the moai, and that when the first European sail crept over the horizon, the island already lay exhausted. There is truth in the pollen record that shows a vanished palm forest whose nuts no longer germinated, and in the wood charcoal that dwindles through the centuries. Yet the fuller tale that archaeology draws from garden beds and bone and ash is more complex and more human. Rats that came ashore in the first canoes gnawed palm seeds so that forests never returned, even when people tried to spare them. Farmers turned to stone mulches and walled enclosures to trap moisture and warmth, and fed their families from soils that strangers would call poor. They built rock gardens that bloom in photographs taken by the midday sun and the evening light. When the winds scoured the uplands, they planted lower and closer to shelter. They learned to live in a new ecology they had helped to make. Collapse is too simple a word for a people who kept building platforms and restoring statues well into the centuries when European ships began to write their own scars on the island's story. The statues themselves have stood at the center of a second debate, for toppled giants gave easy evidence for the tale of ruin. Many moai did fall, some in violent acts when clans fought, and some in sudden tremors when earth shook the footings, and some through long neglect when lichen undercut joints. Yet, the islanders did not cease to care for their ancestors in the centuries before the first European. Recent dating of construction and repair at several ahu shows that work continued into the 1700s, which means that the craft of carving and the rites of raising were still alive when foreign sails first cast their shadows. The old metaphor that the moai walked has found a practical echo in experiments with ropes and song that showed how to bring a statue along a road without wheels or logs, and that knowledge does not sit easily with an image of a people who had forgotten their own arts. On the flanks of Rano Raraku, the quarry still looks like a workshop after a day's work. The truth locked in those slopes is persistence rather than frenzy. A third controversy has to do with the nature of conflict. Oral tradition speaks of years when clans strove against clans, when spear points of obsidian were made, and the strong took from the weak. Archaeologists once held up the triangular blades called matar as proof of constant war. More recent study finds that many of those blades are general tools for cutting and scraping and harvesting as much as they are weapons, and skeletal remains show fewer wounds than the old story would suggest. That does not erase quarrels or bloodshed. It does remind us that hardship does not always drive a people to devour itself. On the contrary, some of the great ahu and moai look like projects that drew hands from several lineages, monuments of cooperation in a landscape of scarcity. Change in ritual is easier to see. On the high lip of Rano Kau, the village of Orongo looks down toward 3 black islets that bite the surf. And there the stone houses with doors like narrow mouths open upon a plaza carved with the figures of a man with a bird head. In that place, men once raced the cliff and the sea to fetch the first egg of the sooty tern from Motu Nui. Whoever prevailed won a year of sacred authority for his sponsor. This birdman cult rose as the age of the great statues waned. It did not erase the old reverence for ancestors, but it pulled power into a new theater. The carved petroglyphs of birdmen on the backs of some moai and on the stones near Orongo make a palimpsest of belief, one rite layered upon another like light upon older paint. The island kept its sense of the sacred, even as it changed the way the sacred was sought. The most brutal turn in the island's fate did not come from within. On an Easter day in the early 1700s, a Dutch admiral named Roggeveen brought his ship to the coast and wrote of thin people and many statues. In the decades that followed, other captains called, and the trade they brought included disease. In the 1860s, raiders from Peru seized islanders by the hundreds to work as slaves on guano islands and plantations, a round of kidnappings that ripped names and skills from Rapa Nui and left sickness in their wake. Missionaries gathered survivors and rewrote the rhythms of life, some with kindness and some with harshness. Later, a single exploiter tried to make the whole island a sheep ranch and penned the people into a corner of their own land. By the last decades of the 19th century, Rapa Nui's population had fallen to a few more than 100 souls. If one must use the word collapse, it belongs to this time of foreign hunger and imported pathogens, not to the centuries when the islanders still moved their ancestors along the roads and set coral eyes to watch over gardens. There is also the question of where the first voyagers came from and whom they later met upon the sea. The language and the bone and the blood say clearly that the founders were Polynesian, kin to the sailors of the Eastern Pacific who settled the far triangles of the ocean. They brought with them the plants of the canoe and the gods of their ancestors and the knowledge of stars and swells. At the same time, the sweet potato that grows under Polynesian names has its wild home in South America, and this stubborn root shows up across the islands long before Europeans carried crops in gunboats and holds. Some genetic studies suggest that a small exchange of people between the island and the American coast may have happened centuries before European ships arrived. A contact that was brief and limited rather than a wholesale settling. The moi did not come from another continent. They belonged to the hands that carved them on Rano Raraku, but the ocean was not a wall. It was a road, and roads have two directions. The legacy of the Moai after the age of toppling is a story of return and care as much as of loss. In the middle years of the 20th century, a great wave born of an earthquake far away rolled against the southern coast and smashed one of the most majestic platforms, Ahu Tongariki, and threw statues like toys. In the 1990s, Chilean archaeologists led a restoration with the help of a Japanese company that brought cranes and skill, and together with islanders, they raised 15 giants again to face the lands of their people. Elsewhere, teams have straightened and steadied statues and repaired dry stone walls that hold the dead. The state has declared much of the island a national park, and the world has placed it on the list of heritage that belongs to all. Visitors come with bright shirts and cameras and walk in places where the crust of soil is thin as a plate. Guides speak in the language of the island and in the languages of guests, and ask that feet keep to the path and hands keep to themselves. Preservation is a daily ritual now, as steady as prayer. The statues have also stepped beyond the horizon of the island to become a symbol that flickers in many minds. Some see caution in them, a warning that a world can consume its gifts if it forgets to count the cost. Some see endurance, a proof that art can bloom even where resources are narrow, and that community can organize itself for a task that is as much spiritual as political. Some see a lesson about story itself, for the easy tale of madness and waste has been tempered by the slower tale of adaptation and resilience. The islanders of today honor their ancestors not only by standing moai back on their ahu, but by teaching children to carve and to dance, and to speak names that were almost taken from them. A people who once looked to coral eyes for guardianship now look to laws and to their own vigilance to protect stones that are not only history, but family. If one stands at Orongo in the late light and gazes at the sea that once sent eggs and raiders and traders and scholars, the arc of the island story feels both local and wide. The surf breaks on Motu Nui as it always has. The wind scours the cliff and hums along the thin roofs of the stone houses. Far below on the flats, the platforms catch the last fire of the day, and the moai throw long shadows toward the gardens. In those shadows are the debates that scholars still tend and the memories that families still carry. The truth that emerges from them is not that Rapa Nui is a riddle solved, but that it is a place where human will and belief shaped stone and soil into a shared destiny. And that destiny bent, but did not break when the world pressed hard upon it. In the dry hills above the plains of Urfa, there is a mound that looks from a distance like a sleeping beast. The locals call it Potbelly Hill. For ages, shepherds grazed their flocks there, and farmers turned up carved stones with their plows and set them in garden walls. The first scholars who walked the slope in the last century wrote of broken pillars and curious fragments, but it was not until the mid-1990s that a careful eye lingered and refused to look away. When the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt set his boots on that knoll and brushed aside the thorn, he saw not a field of chance stones, but the bones of a sanctuary older than cities. Spades went in, and the hill began to give up circles. The earth peeled back like a scab, and there under the sun lay rings of limestone pillars set upright in sockets cut into the bedrock. Each ring gathered around a taller pair that stood in the center, like officiants at a rite. The pillars were not raw blocks. They were shaped into the outline of a letter that men would one day draw, top broad and crosswise like a head and shoulders, shaft straight like a trunk, a stylized body without a face. On some, low reliefs showed arms carved along the flanks and hands folded upon the belly. Around the belts of a few were fox skins and small pouches, the dress of beings that seemed both human and other. It was as if an assembly of elders had agreed to become stone. The circles opened in sequence, lettered by excavators for ease of memory. In one, the central pair rose more than 5 meters into the air and weighed the burden of many tons. In all, the surrounding rings of lesser pillars faced inward, as if the stones themselves were audience and witness. The walls that completed each circle were dry, laid from small blocks of limestone, fitted by hand, and along the inner face low benches ran, places where offerings might be set or where the dead might be invoked. The floor was the living bedrock of the hill, smoothed in places as if a careless footfall had polished it over time. The central pillars were not only higher, they were also marked with emblems. A belt with a buckle and a fox pelt draped like a loincloth were carved upon one, and along the shafts of several ran those long arms and hands, the fingers meeting upon the belly with a serenity that unsettles. There is a quiet power in those gestures. They make the stones into presences. Everywhere, animals walked the pillars. Boars bristled. Gazelles leapt as if startled from thorn. Foxes slipped along the stone with the sly length of their bodies captured in clean lines. Vultures stood with outspread wings, and below one vulture, a small human figure seemed to lie as if offered to the sky. Scorpions crouched with tails bent forward. Snakes twined in bundles or struck with fangs bare. Wild cattle pushed heavy heads into the base of a pillar as if to topple it. The carvers cut these creatures in low relief so crisp that a fingertip can still find the curve of a feather and the notch of a claw. Some of the stones bear abstract signs repeated across the site, simple shapes that we do not yet read. The men who cut them had flint tools only, but they tamed limestone with flake and hammerstone and then smoothed the surfaces until the edges held light like a blade. When one stands within a ring, one is among beasts that were once the masters of those hills and the food of the hunters who built the sanctuary. The wolves and snakes and birds are not trophies here, they are a grammar. The dates were a whisper first, then a shout. Charcoal from layers that sealed the rings, bone from the feasts thrown there, and the very sediments that washed over the floors under the last spade have been measured again and again. The oldest circles belong to a time around 9,600 years before the birth of Christ, soon after the last great cold loosed its grip. This pushes the sanctuary into an era before pottery, before metal, and before the fully settled life that would later raise towns with streets and ovens. The builders were foragers who gathered wild grain and hunted gazelle and boar and aurochs. They knew the ripening of pistachio and almond, and the habits of migrating herds. Yet on this hill they gathered to raise stones taller than houses, with a choreography of labor that shames our easy stories about what hunters can or cannot do. The scale of the project implies a web of cooperation, the ability to feed many hands for many seasons, and a will to cut and haul and carve for a purpose that was not bread. The hill tells another kind of truth by what it lacks. Within the circles there are no hearths where daily meals were cooked. There are no crushed floors smeared with charcoal that speak of regular living. There are no scatterings of domestic rubbish, no ovens for baking, no small storage pits to hold a family's stores. Instead, there are piles of flint flakes from tool making and carving. There are great quantities of animal bones cracked and burned and tossed aside, and there are stone bowls and pestles and mortars, implements that can grind wild barley or einkorn or crush seeds into meal or mash. In some of the large limestone basins, residues have been found that speak of fermentation, a mineral trace that forms when a drink draws sugars from grain. If this reading is right, then those who gathered at the hill did not only eat, they drank together as well, and the feasts that the bones attest were not only for the body, but for the binding of the many into one purpose. Quarries lie all around the crown of the hill. One can see where the pillar makers cut trenches around a shape drawn on the bedrock and then pried with levers until the stone loosened. Shallow pedestals remain like shadows of the pillars that were carried off, flat scars no taller than a handspan, each the base that once held a giant fast by its heels, while carvers worked the front and sides. Ramps and smooth patches hint at how those blocks were brought to the rings. Rope and pole and lever and a patient tune of grunt and chant would have moved them step by step. The sockets that receive the pillars are tight and carefully cut. Packing stones wedge each shaft so that it stands with the elegance of a plant rooted in its native ground. It is work that must have been rehearsed again and again until teams knew exactly how to lift and set without cracking the limestone throat. The food refuse tells who came to the feasts. The bones are mostly of gazelle, along with wild cattle and boar and deer. Birds appear as well, including vultures and cranes. The butchery marks are swift and practiced. Heads and hooves were cut away, meat stripped, marrow cracked free. The sheer amount of bone in the fill suggests gatherings far larger than one small camp could produce. Grinding tools are numerous and battered from hard use. Flint blades abound, their edges retouched again and again, a rain of sharp waste that fell around the carvers as they worked on reliefs and smoothed pillar faces. The hill has given up a few small human bones too, but no regular graves have been found within the main circles. If the rites here touched death, they did so by symbol rather than by burial. The vulture that holds a small headless figure on one famous pillar may speak to a practice known from other early communities where bodies were exposed to birds before the bones were gathered. A hard rite at the edge of life and order that returns a person to sky and earth. The hill did not remain the same. After centuries, when the largest circles were used and renewed, later builders raised smaller enclosures with pillars of lesser height, and then, later still, put up rooms with straight walls and right angles that look more like the spaces of people on the cusp of the settled life. This change may reflect a shift from a world of bands and seasonal gatherings to a world where people stayed longer and tended fields close by. Near at hand, in the mountains to the north, the wild ancestor of wheat has its home. And the first experiments that made einkorn into a plant that trusts a human hand likely unfolded within 1,000 years of the oldest rings. Whether the hill helped to call farming into being, or whether the same pressure that made people gather in great numbers also pressed them toward planting, is a quiet question in the soil. It is enough for now to note that ceremony and cultivation rose together on this frontier after the ice withdrew. One of the strangest acts at the hill is the deliberate burial of its glory. The great rings did not fall and vanish in storms. People filled them in. Tons of soil and rubble and refuse were shoveled into the circles until the pillars were buried to their shoulders and then to their heads. In the fill were the remnants of feasts and tool-making and the broken bits of daily life. This was not the slow drift of wind and dust, it was a decision. Perhaps the people turned to new sanctuaries on neighboring hills and could not keep the old ones. Perhaps the rite demanded a sacred closing, as formal as its opening. Perhaps a change of belief or a change of climate ended a certain way of gathering. Whatever the reason, their careful burial gave the hill to the archaeologist as a sealed room, the pillars preserved by the weight of the very earth that hid them. The wider country now whispers that the hill was not alone. Across the Jurmas Range and beyond, other mounds have shown the same T-shaped pillars and the same reliefs of fox and snake and wild bull. Karahan Tepe and Sayberts and other places have opened small windows into a culture that understood how to set stones in rings and to make animals walk on limestone walls at the dawn of the New Age. Together, they draw a map of a ritual landscape that stretched across the uplands, a net of gathering places where hunters and first gardeners came together to eat and remember and recount what the sky does each year. The hill above Urfa sits within that net, like a jewel. What has been uncovered there is only a fraction of what lies below the scrub. Most of the mound remains untouched, and it is likely that more rings wait in the dark. Today, a shelter of steel shades, the most exposed of the circles and walkways, carry visitors above the carved stones. Guides speak of the first temples and of a time when people without pottery cut a cathedral from the living ground. The wind still hunts across the ridge, and the sun still bleaches the limestone white at noon. When evening comes, the pillars cool and the reliefs step forward in the low light. It is then that the hands folded on a belly and the silent stare of a headless top begin to feel like a conversation across time. There is no writing to tell us who stood here at dawn and what words were spoken. No chronicle to name the clans or the feasts. Only the stubborn facts of circles and carvings and bones and the haunted quiet of a place that mattered so much that people moved hills to make it endure. The hill above Urfa has stirred the old order of things like a staff in a still pool. For a century ago, many would have said that fields must come before temples and that bread must come before ceremony. Now, the circles argue for a more braided story. Some scholars see in the feasting debris and the labor of hauling pillars a pressure that could have pushed for cultivation, since a community that gathers hundreds must feed them with more than chance hunts, and a taste for drink brewed from wild grain can quickly become a habit that encourages sowing along the valley floors. Others answer that social complexity and ritual ambition can rise among foragers without planted wheat, that people with keen knowledge of wild herds and seasonal stands of grain already had the surplus and the networks to raise stone when the moment demanded it. The bones and the charcoal will not settle the argument on their own. What they do say with certainty is that the earliest Neolithic was not only a season of hearths and huts, but also a season of shared myths made visible in stone. Meaning remains the deeper quarrel. The pillars carry belts and hands and the pelts of foxes, which makes them seem like beings rather than posts. And the animals that parade upon their faces are not farmyard friends, but the teeth and wings and coils that haunted a hunter's dreams. Some think clan totems stood here facing one another in a parliament of spirits, each group gathering under its sign to make peace and feast. Others see rites of death, for vultures and headless figures appear, and in the fill of the hill, archaeologists found human skull fragments cut with grooves as if they had been displayed. A hard practice known from other early sanctuaries where bones spoke on behalf of the dead. There are those who look for the sky in the plan and have claimed that certain gates meet certain stars, while careful surveys answer that any such alignments are at best suggestive and at worst the wishful sightlines of a later age. The safe ground is that the place bound animals and ancestors and season into a language we no longer read, and that those who came here felt themselves in the presence of powers that live beyond any one hill. Even the ending is a riddle that shows intent without surrendering cause. The circles were not left to decay at the mercy of wind. They were filled deliberately and sealed, as if a ritual closing demanded that the elders of stone be put to sleep beneath a cairn made from the leavings of the people who had met there. Some think a new shrine on a neighboring mound drew the faithful away, and that the old one was respectfully retired. Some hear in the later rooms with straight corners the echo of villages taking shape, and imagine that sanctity moved downhill toward daily life. The burial gave us the gift of preservation, but it also draws a veil over the whispers that might have lingered on walls, left bare to centuries of Sunday. The legacy runs well beyond one mound. Across the limestone of the region, other hills have yielded T-shaped pillars and animal reliefs, proof that an entire constellation of sanctuaries once glowed in these uplands in the age before baked clay and metal. The discovery has forced a wider respect for the ingenuity of communities that lived by hunting and gathering and the earliest gardening, and it has tempered the old habit of measuring ancestors by the tools they lacked. In our time, a shelter spans the most open rings and walkways lift visitors above the carvings, while curators and engineers worry wisely about erosion and about the pressure of too many feet upon fragile soil. The world has written the hill's name on the roll of places to be kept for all, and yet the site has also fed the modern hunger for marvels that would turn human craft into the work of strangers from the sky. The answer to such fancies lies in the flint flakes and the lever scars and the sockets cut clean into bedrock. For together, they tell the steadier truth that hands with patient skill made a cathedral without bricks, and did so with no tools that could not be chipped from stone. What Göbekli Tepe finally gives us is a change in our own imagination. It shows that the first chapters of settled life were written in more voices than we had guessed, and that people will lift enormous weights for ideas as readily as for walls. It makes us picture bands of men and women who could sing together while hauling a pillar, share meat and drink under a ring of watching animals, and then bury their work when their story turned a page. In that picture, there is grandeur and there is intimacy, and there is a caution as well, for memory is fragile, and the meanings we long for can never be forced from the stone. We are left with the patient work of reading, and the humbler wonder that such a place existed at all. On a shelf, in a war-hung museum, among tablets, pressed with the nail marks of ancient scribes and vessels, lifted whole from earth, the color of tea, there once sat a small clay jar whose fame would grow far beyond its size. It was found in the soil near the village of Kujut Rabu outside Baghdad in the years before the world was torn by another great war. Workmen brought it to the attention of a young conservator, Wilhelm Koenig, who handled it with the care of a physician and the curiosity of a locksmith. The vessel itself was unremarkable at first glance, a squat terracotta jar the height of a man's hand, narrow-shouldered and pale, the sort of thing that had kept oil or wine for countless generations. What made it singular was what slept inside the clay. Seated within was a sheet of copper rolled into a cylinder and soldered closed at the bottom, and down the center of that copper tube ran an iron rod. The whole assembly sealed at the mouth with a plug of black bitumen that kept the pieces from kissing one another. Time had gnawed both metals. The iron was scarred with rust. The copper bore the green bloom of age. Yet the arrangement was unmistakable. A metal within a metal kept apart by pitch, as if the jar were a small theater and the actors stood forever on their marks. Koenig looked upon that odd union and let his mind walk. He had seen the simple experiments of his own day, how a strip of one metal and a strip of another will trade their patience when bathed in a sour liquor, and how that quiet bickering can be harnessed to make a needle twitch or a faint light tremble. He knew that vinegar will bite a metal gently and that grape juice will give up its sweetness to a current. He imagined that if the jar were filled with such a fluid, the iron and the copper might secretly speak in the language of electrons. He wrote his thoughts, suggesting a date in the time of the Parthian kings, somewhere between the last centuries before Christ and the first after. And he proposed that in the valleys of the Tigris, someone had contrived a device that could make a trickle of power. It was a daring reading in a sober age, and it would follow the jar like a rumor follows a noble house. The ground where the jar was found lays out its own history in layers that spade and trowel can read. The site lies in the old orbit of Ctesiphon and Seleucia, cities where Greek language once met Iranian custom and where Roman arms often tried their luck. The pottery types in the fill and the chips of coins from neighboring mounds have long argued for a horizon of Parthian or early Sasanian date, a span from roughly the 2nd century before Christ into the 3rd or 4th century of our era. Other jars of similar shape and with similar fittings appeared in the collections of the museum, some complete, some broken, a few with fragments of asphalt stoppers still clinging like scabs to the mouth. Not all were exact twins. Some copper cylinders were longer or shorter, some iron rods thicker or worn to a wire by time, but the family resemblance was plain. These were not solitary accidents. They were a type, repeated with intent, and that alone demanded an answer. The materials speak as clearly as the clay. The copper cylinder is a modest thing, made from sheet rolled and lightly joined with a simple seam. The iron rod is no more than a nail length of metal smoothed by the maker, and in some examples capped with a small disc that kept it centered beneath the black lid. The bitumen that seals the mouth is ancestral in that country, a gift of the ground itself, abundant along the Tigris and the Euphrates, used since the dawn of cities to caulk boats, to glue inlays, and to keep water from the bones of the dead. That pitch insulates, and in these jars it separates iron from copper and fixes both inside their clay house. The internal space between tube and rod is narrow but real. It wants to be filled by something more than air if the jar is to have a purpose more than clever carpentry. When replicas have been made with these same pieces, and the gap has been fed with grape juice, or vinegar, or the sour liquor of dates, A small but honest push upon a needle can be coaxed from the device. One jar will not stir much. A ring of jars tied together will waken a taste of power that can tinge a coin with a film of metal in a basin and bite the tongue if one is reckless enough to taste with the mouth what should be measured with a wire. Yet the earth that gave the jar is slow to surrender a tale that fits too neatly. Within the original vessels, no clear residue of ancient acid has been reported, though the desert keeps such traces poorly unless trapped by chance. The copper carries no certain scars of steady electroplating within its throat. The iron is rusted, as iron will rust in damp air, though its pattern of corrosion has been read by some as the work of liquid and by others as the simple tooth of time. The context of discovery is sadly sparse, for the jars were not found sleeping intact beneath a sealed floor with offerings around them. They came from disturbed layers, from the rough pit and the spoil of earlier digging, from a time when the urgency of building and the hazards of war made fine field notes fragile. In such uncertainty, every interpretation must wear humility, like a cloak. The culture in which the jar was born offers both promises and cautions. In the workshops of Mesopotamia and Persia, and the Greek cities that traded with them, metals were worked with mastery. Silver was gilded by fire gilding in later centuries, a trick with mercury that is as dangerous as it is effective. Thin films of gold and silver were laid upon copper by hammering and burnishing in earlier ages, and the skill to make a thing appear richer than it was is older than any king whose name we can cleanly pronounce. Magic also flourished in those lands. Texts speak of amulets and cures, of jars sealed against demons, of scrolls protected by layers of metal and pitch, of sympathetic techniques in which one substance was believed to influence another across a boundary. A copper cylinder and an iron rod within a sealed jar would make as serviceable a reliquary as they would a simple cell. One can imagine a prayer written on a thin strip and slipped inside the tube, and then the mouth sealed with the breath of bitumen, the whole set in a tomb or a wall. One can also imagine a practical purpose that leaves few archaeological bruises, a device that was filled at need, used for an hour to plait a small charm or to startle the faithful with a tingle, and then emptied, cleaned, and set aside. In the galleries of the National Museum of Iraq, the jar became a small celebrity, its label a prompt for guides to tell stories both cautious and bold. In laboratories far away, engineers and historians built gentle copies and watched meters jump just enough to make an eyebrow rise. A quiet experiment in an American workshop in the middle years of the last century stacked a dozen such jars and gave a coin a whisper-thin coat of silver in a bath, proving not that the ancients had done so, but that such a thing could be done with nothing more than copper, iron, clay, and sour wine. Television would later repeat the trick with fanfare and vinegar and embolden a public appetite for marvels, while scholars in journals reminded readers that possibility is not proof. Between these poles the artifact has stood, a small clay house that invites both restraint and wonder. What is solid is the thing itself, a jar that marries earthenware to two metals in a way that begs a function beyond storage. What is likely is that it was made in the crowded centuries when Parthian kings and early Sasanian lords took their ease along the Tigris. What is unknown is whether the space between copper and iron once held a scented acid, a scroll, a charm, or simply the air of its own age. The bottle does not answer when we ask it. It only endures, and in enduring it has become a mirror in which we see both the craft of an ancient people and the hunger of a modern one to find in small things the promise of large meanings. From the day the little jar and its sleeve of copper and nail of iron were set upon a table beneath the museum's calm light, the piece has stood between two tempers of mind. On one side are those who see in it the ambition to conjure a current from sour wine, and so they imagine a row of such vessels linked by cords. A bench of jars humming with a power that would turn a bath of salts, the color of smoke, into a skin of precious metal on a waiting trinket. On the other side are those who warn that desire is a poor master for evidence, and that an object must be read in the language of the ground that birthed it. Wilhelm Koenig himself put the thought of a cell into print, and later generations proved in workshops that a clay jar with a copper sleeve and an iron core will indeed make a spark of life if one fills the gap with vinegar or the liquor of Pesa. Grapes. A single vessel gives a timid push. A dozen in a ring wake a livelier murmur. In a modern basin, a coin may take a whisper-thin coat. Yet the jar from Kujut Rabu does not confess that it ever held such a bath. The desert keeps few scents and fewer stains. No clear residue of ancient acid has been coaxed from the pores. No wire slept beside the clay to show that a series once ran from one mouth to the next. The corrosion on the metals reads like long burial to some eyes, and like the fretting of liquid to others. Between those glances, the truth keeps its counsel. The craft history of the Near East complicates the tale in ways both sobering and grand. Artisans from the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, and from the high plateaus beyond learned, to clothe base metals in noble skins without asking the aid of a hidden current. They beat gold into leaf and burnished it upon copper until it held fast. They joined thin sheets by heat and hammer until a common bowl shone like the gift of a king. In later centuries they would gild with mercury, laying a bright death upon bronze that would hold like a promise once the mercury had fled in a poisonous vapor. These methods leave their own signatures under a lens, different scars and different seams from those that a bath of salts would write. When objects from Parthian and Sasanian graves wear gold today, conservators read the marks of hammer and fire rather than the quiet geometry of ions. This does not prove that no one ever tried the gentler trick that a child can now repeat on a school bench. It does remind us that a culture rich in metalwork already held a full chest of proven techniques, and that a new device must be fitted to a need that the old arts could not meet. Other uses fit the jar with equal grace and ask less of the unseen. The land that gave up this object has long loved containers within containers, seals within seals, charms bound in copper and bitumen, and laid in walls or graves where their virtue would not be spoiled by air or damp. Iron can be a simple spine to center a plug. A copper cylinder can guard a rolled strip of thin lead, or a small papyrus, or a curl of parchment that carries a spell or a prayer. Bitumen is as old as the barges that crossed the river at Ur, and as practical as a fisherman's hands. In such a reading, the jar is an amulet made stout against time, not an engine. There are texts from that world that speak of bound things and sealed things and words that must not be touched by daylight. There are graves where metal tubes once held messages for the dead or for the powers that watch over them. None of this can be proved for the museum jar without the very scroll that time has eaten. It remains a plausible shape into which these fragments can be poured. Medical fancy has been offered and should be weighed and then set gently aside. Some modern storytellers have imagined a healer dipping a pair of wires into a tonic and letting a patient feel the sting of a current as a sign that the remedy had teeth. A battery of jars can sting, that is not in doubt. But no ancient manual speaks of such a practice. No relief shows a physician with a cord in his hand. And the culture of cures in that age leaned upon plants and knives and incantations rather than upon the invisibles that make needles quiver in our time. The absence of witness is not proof of absence. It is a warning to leave romance in its proper place. The debate over the jar has had a curious second life in the modern mind. It has taken a small artifact and turned it into a banner for those who would fill the past with machines the past did not need. It has walked the stages of certain shows where wonder is served with a heavy spice of credulity, and where vinegar and copper and iron short out into talk of lost sciences. Archaeologists have replied with what patience they can muster, and have used the object as a lesson in method. Context matters more than cleverness. A thing is what its neighbors and its soil and its scars say it is, not what a tidy diagram on a blackboard could make it be. Replication is welcome, but not decisive. 100 devices that work today do not rewrite yesterday unless the ground consents. Even so, the legacy of the jar is not only caution. It has charmed students into laboratories and has made engineers reach for clay and copper and iron with a craftsman's joy. It has reminded the public that ancient curiosity was not our invention, and that a hand 2,000 years old might have loved the same little miracles that make a modern child laugh. It has given curators a chance to speak about the Parthian age, about Seleucia and Ctesiphon, and the trade that braided Greek talk to Iranian manners, about the wealth of techniques a good smith could command. It has also taught a harder lesson about the cost of poor records. The wars that shook Iraq shook its museums and stores, and though guardians and neighbors risked much to keep many treasures safe, gaps opened in ledgers and boxes, and the slim notes that might have set this jar squarely in its place were thinned by disorder. From that loss comes a renewed discipline among excavators to tie each find to its earth, as if the thread could never be knotted again. What can finally be said with confidence is modest and worthy. The so-called battery is a well-made object of clay and metal from a world that prized both magic and measure, and it stands at a crossroads where our questions say as much about us as about it. If it made a current in its day, it likely did so in moments and at small scale, for tricks and plating and curiosity rather than for lamps and engines. If it never tasted vinegar, it still speaks of hands that knew how to join dissimilar things and to keep them apart for a purpose. It has become a mirror, and in it we see both the reach of ancient craft and the hunger of modern minds to find kinship across centuries. The tale begins not with a broken stone or a diver's lamp, but with a voice in a room, a philosopher in the 4th century before Christ setting a story upon the table as one might set a chessboard, inviting his guests to imagine a world beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where a great island once rose from the sea. In the dialogues named Timaeus and Critias, Plato speaks through the memory of Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who traveled to the Nile and heard from priests at Say of a power that had flourished far to the west 9,000 years before Solon's own day. They called it Atlantis, a realm ringed by water and land, ruled by kings who traced their line to Poseidon, rich in metals and beasts and grain. It was a place of canals and walls, of harbors crowded with ships, of a plain laid out with surveyor's care and mountains that caught the clouds. The priests told how this proud nation turned its armies east, and the Athenians of primeval time stood against them, and how, after a day and a night of earthquakes and floods, the island sank, and the sea above it became a shoal of mud through which no ship could pass. Plato set this tale to serve a moral, to weigh hubris against virtue, Yet he covered his fable with a cloth of details that has tempted later ages to lift the corner and peer beneath. In Critias, the description grows thick as a stand of reeds along a riverbank. The capital lies in concentric rings of sea and earth, crossed by bridges and gates. A great canal runs to the ocean. The walls are faced with red and black and white stone and sheathed with bright metal that the Greeks called orichalcum. Temples gleam with gold and silver, and the image of Poseidon stands with a chariot of horses at the heart of a sanctuary open to the sky. Elephants wander the outer country, and pastures feed flocks across a well-watered plain. The kings divide the island into shares and swear oaths over a bull hunted without weapons, and for long years they rule in balance, until wealth breeds pride, and the divine part of their nature thins like wine mixed too freely with water. The story breaks off mid-breath, the dialogue unfinished, the final trial unwritten. What remains feels like the draft of a lost chapter of history, a fiction dressed in the grammar of a report. That tension between parable and inventory is what has kept the name alive, like an ember turned in the ash. If the text gives us the skeleton, the world has offered the flesh of other losses that show how cities can be here one season and gone the next. In the middle of the second millennium before Christ, a volcano on the island we now call Santorini blew itself into the sky with a force that flung pumice across the sea and tore open the caldera that holds the blue water like a bellon. Crown. On the southern tip of that island, the town of Akrotiri lies beneath meters of ash, its streets and houses preserved by catastrophe, its frescoes of ships and lilies and swallows frozen in a spring that never ended. Along the shores of Crete and the coasts of the Aegean, there are layers of sand and stone that speak of waves and flood, and in the quiet of harbors, the sediment holds a dusting of fine ash that matches the breath of Thera. The palaces of the Minoans had already risen and would endure a while yet, but the sea changed its voice and the balance of power shifted across the islands. No single ruin here gives us Atlantis, but together they show how a maritime world can be shaken when the earth opens its throat. Closer to Plato's own lifetime, a city called Helike lived on the Corinthian Gulf and made offerings to Poseidon. In the winter of 373 before Christ, the ground began to tremble, and in a night the city was swallowed by the sea. Travelers in later years spoke of colonnades glimpsed under clear water and of fishermen who brought up fragments of bronze in their nets. In our time, patient survey in the plain has found walls and coin hoards and streets buried not far from the present shore. Monuments drowned by earthquake and by the slow hand of silt that raised the land even as it stole a city. To the north, in the shallows off Laconia, lies Pavlopetri, a town from the age of sages and kings of the Bronze Age, its rooms and roads mapped beneath a thin veil of water. To the west of the Nile mouth near Alexandria, statues and temple stones of Thonis Heracleon and Canopus were taken by divers from the ooze of a bay. Cities that slid into the sea as the delta subsided and the ground liquefied, their colossi and shrines now gleaming in museum light after centuries of sleep. Farther off in time, beneath the Mediterranean surface at Atlit Yam, the stones of a Neolithic village lie with a well still brimming and a circle of megaliths set as if for a rite, all drowned when the sea crept higher as the age of ice withdrew. These are not myths but facts. They teach how shorelines wander and how memory can become legend when water takes what it wants. The old flood stories of the two rivers speak another language of loss. In the epic that sings the tale of a king in Uruk, a survivor of a deluge tells how the gods chose him to build a boat and how waters rose and washed away the homes of men. In tablets that carry the lines of priests, lists of kings and cities break around an event remembered as a flood. Archaeology in the plains of Sumer has found washed layers and clean sands between older mud bricks, marks of local inundations that would have felt to any village like the end of the age. In the north, the legends of a land that once linked Britain to the continent, a low country of marsh and river that sank by slow drowning as the sea rose, are now drawn in sonar as wide fields of sand ridges and lost channels. We call it Doggerland, and its departure from the air is measured in thousands of years. It is hardly Plato's island, yet it confirms a truth that antiquity knew in its bones. The water gives, and the water takes away. So the origins of Atlantis live in a single pair of dialogues that marry moral instruction to geographic detail and trace their authority to the council of Egyptian priests. And the evidence that the world offers lives in places that perished for reasons we can count and map. Volcano and quake and the creeping hand of the sea have erased towns whole and great. The earth has buried others under sand and silt, and only the chart and the shovel bring them back to sight. When people speak of lost civilizations, they touch this very human fear and this very human memory, that our works can vanish between dawn and dawn. The story that Plato began survives because it stands in the archway between allegory and experience, because it looks toward the horizon that many cultures feared, and because the ruins we have found under ash and under waves show us that loss on a grand scale is not only possible, but common across ages. The quarrel over Atlantis begins with the intent of the teller. Was Plato passing down a memory from the archives of Egypt, or was he shaping a parable about pride and the proper order of the state, gilded with measures and maps to give his lesson the weight of likelihood? The dialogues themselves are careful about purpose. They set Athens as the virtuous foil and Atlantis as the realm that forgets the divine part of its nature, and the story pauses just where the sermon would strike. Many classicists argue that the island was crafted to serve philosophy, a mirror in which citizens were meant to see themselves warned. Others point to the thick net of detail, to canals and rings and mountains and oaths, and a plain measured as if by a surveyor. And they ask whether an author who loved forms would have hung so many numbers upon a fiction unless some remembered geography tugged at his sleeve. Even here, the dates rebel. 9,000 years before Solon would banish the tale to a time when Athens did not yet exist in the shape the story demands. Scholars have played with the arithmetic, asking if an Egyptian priest might have meant months rather than years, or if the number had drifted in the current of retelling, which would move the event toward the late Bronze Age, where the violence of Thera grants the tale a possible horizon. No column of figures can compel a verdict. We are left with the text itself and with the habit of the ancient world to speak truths in the language of invention. Because the world often sinks what it first raises, each age has found its own shore for Atlantis to haunt. Minoan Crete plays the part with ease, for it had great palaces, merchant fleets, and a taste for bright metal, and its fortunes wavered when the volcano at Thera changed the sea and the sky. Iberia has claimed the tale with marshlands near the old mouth of the Guadalquivir, where rings of earth and water can be seen in the right sun, and with coins and texts that remember ancient Tartessos as a place of metal and trade. Others have led the search to the Atlantic shelf, to the cold coasts of the north, to the Caribbean where a natural beach rock at Bimini once tempted the hopeful, to the seafloor off Japan where the terraces of Yonaguni look to some like a quarried ziggurat, but crumble under a geologist's eye into layers born of pressure and wave. Of late, a circle in the Sahara that looks from the sky like a pupil has drawn dreamers westward, The Risha structure that erosion carved from a dome of stone, and which has drawn the name of Atlantis simply because the eye loves a spiral. In each case, the Earth answers with its own patience. Palaces and ports can be mapped and dated. Beach rock forms in tidy lines under natural forces. Sandstone breaks into steps when water and time insist. The tale of an island as wide as a realm remains out of reach. The material called orichalcum is another lure for the imagination. Plato's city gleamed with it, and readers have argued about the substance for 2,000 years. In early Greek, thought the word sometimes named a metal that shone like the dawn. In Roman usage, it often meant a fine brass, a copper alloy colored like gold. Ingots of such an alloy have been found in a ship that sank near Sicily in the last century before Christ, stamped and stacked as cargo, and the discovery delighted those who chase the gleam of the old name. But a fair brass from a Roman hold is not proof of a lost island in the Western Sea. It is proof of skill in metallurgy and trade, both of which the ancient world had in abundance, and both of which Plato also loved to set shining within his prose. The temptation to read every drowned wall as a trace of the great island is as old as the first divers at Helic and as new as the latest scan of a silted bay. Underwater archaeology has answered that hunger with both gifts and corrections. Pavlo-Petri lies on the seabed like a town in a glass case and shows streets and courtyards from the age of heroes, yet it is no empire and no ringed capital. The temples of Heracleon and Canopus came up from the Nile mouth with inscriptions and statues that tell of trade and ritual and the slow subsidence of the delta. These places teach that loss is common and that the sea is an archivist as well as a thief. They also teach that ruins must be read in their own tongue. When a harbor city drowns by earthquake and mud, it needs no larger legend to grant it dignity. The patience that has mapped these sites has become a discipline with its own virtues. It has given us sonar maps of coasts that wandered in antiquity, and catalogues of amphorae, and quiet galleries where a visitor can watch a god's bronze arm emerge from a century of silt. And in that slow work, the urge to make one myth explain all ruin has been mercifully restrained. The story's legacy in the modern world is a tale of mirrors. It has drawn explorers with good hearts to measure honest bays. It has armed nationalists and dreamers with a convenient past to flatter whatever future they want. It has lured merchants who sell vague maps, and it has inspired painters and poets who could not care less for quarry marks and dates. It has also seeded the public with a true lesson that needs no golden island. Civilizations do vanish. Fields salt themselves with neglect and with storm. Rivers shift and drown their own cities. Forests leave only pollen in a core pulled from a bog. The sand can cover a capital in a single season if the winds favor it. The sea is patient and it is stronger than any charter. In that sober recognition, there is a better awe than the simple desire for a sunken empire. It is the awe of humility. So the debate is not a trial that ends with a clean verdict. It is a long conversation between text and stone, between a philosopher who wrapped a warning in a travelogue and an earth that grants us ruins enough without the need for kingdoms that never were. The legend endures because it lets us ask what we will become if the harbor silt fills and the fields fail, and because the world keeps showing us that loss is part of the grammar of history. We read Plato, and we walk the edges of drowned towns with cameras and with care, and somewhere between the two, we learn to honor both the measured line and the measured fable. Night gathers over old stones and older seas, and the voices of ages thin to a hush. We have stood where the desert burns gold, and heard the patient arithmetic of Giza, watched dawn comb the chalk of Salisbury, and turn a ring of sarsen to a calendar of light. Flown above a Peruvian pampa, where prayers were written by removing the very skin of the earth, and we have turned with careful fingers the idea of a drowned Greek machine that made the sky move on a dial. We have walked the wind of Rapa Nui and felt the gaze of ancestors cut from a volcano's flank, climbed a pot-bellied hill where hunters raised pillars and gave animals a second life in stone, peered into a humble jar whose purpose may never consent to a single name, and listened while a philosopher dressed a warning as a geography and sent it out upon the sea. The mysteries remain, and that is well, for it is the grain of the unknown that makes the known gleam. What endures beneath every riddle is the touch of human hands, patient and stubborn, curious and devout, forever setting cord to stake and chisel to stone, forever measuring the heavens and the heart. Let us leave the ruins to their rest and carry away the honesty of their silence. The past has not drifted away from us. It waits where it always has, in the next question, in the next step, in the next small light.